Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Strategoy video. Yes, we are back with part two of our preparing for AOS 4th edition. Jonas, is this the first time you've ever put a model as the art for the opening slide here?
It is. It's a huge milestone, you guys. I couldn't find any proper art for fourth edition anymore that we haven't used before. So this is the first time I'm using a model. I still think it's quite okay because it has a decent background, but yeah, it's weird. What do you think?
It's funny because when you see a model this zoomed in, you actually start to see the little details that make it more impressive when you don't see the little details. Let's put it that way. The
Yeah,
definition,
yeah,
it's not. I mean, it's way better than I can paint, but still.
yeah, the grainy texture on the metals.
Yeah, yeah.
But then
Are
the
they?
exquisite detail on the scroll work though.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Do you know if they have to use Citadel paints for GW models? I assume they do, right?
Hmm. I don't actually think they do. I mean, they probably do, but at least in a much earlier state of GW life, a lot of their products weren't even from Citadel. But maybe now that the Citadel range has kind of picked up its space and has kind of developed to a point where it's on par with all the other big brands. I think they might actually be, yeah, obligated to, or to, they might be obligated to use Citadel paints. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, obviously we've got a lot of content to cover here, so maybe I shouldn't be leaning in on the model and the cover here. But it's obviously good to hear your voice again. You've been real busy. I've been a sort of busy in the past couple weeks. It's been about 2 weeks since we got our last announcement, I think, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as in the last time we did a video. Obviously, we've gotten tons of announcements, but since we've covered anything,
Hmm.
so we've got a lot of content to cover. Yeah. So I don't know. Is there anything else you want to get out there before we get rolling?
Just to clarify, we're up to date with everything up till this Thursday, so the 25th of April. So everything is included up until the battle pack, which you will see in the next slides that we've arrived at now.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be leading it today because Jonas, you said you're not only a little bit wiped out from a pretty severe work week, I guess, but also because your voice is giving you a little pain,
Yeah.
giving you a little frustration. So I'll be leading this, but obviously I'm curious to see what your take is on all this stuff. I don't know if you spent as much time as I have, kind of.
Definitely not. You guys, you should have seen Ryan's prep work. It's insane. How many pages is it?
I think it's like 9 in a shared Word doc,
Yeah.
9 pages of all the articles in the
But
past.
9 pages of almost full text, right?
Yeah, neat. Not so many bullet points. Yeah,
No.
that's true.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I wanted to make sure we were thorough about this because I knew you were going to be making slides, and I just wanted to make sure you didn't have to go do everything I did, which was reading through between the lines on the GW articles, which sometimes can get a little overwhelming. I've had to read through multiple things multiple times, I should say. Okay, but the summary here, we're going to talk about the new models, the new rules, some Warscroll breakdowns, and then the battle pack stuff. But obviously, there's all kinds of stuff that kind of doesn't seem to be covered here. Like magic, I suppose, falls under new rules.
Yeah.
But each one of the articles that's come out has been a little bit scattered. Sometimes we'll get just a model reveal. Sometimes we'll get models with rules. Sometimes we get Warscrolls with an extra thing like the new version of Lookout Sir. So
Yeah.
it's kind of scattered here and there, and we've kind of arranged it in a way that I think is probably easier to pick up if you're not reading it sequentially through the chronological, listing of the articles as they've come out.
Exactly. Yeah, the point was kind of if we're starting off with the Warscroll breakdown, for example, and I've included all the new Warscrolls we've seen so far, there would have been a need to explain a bunch of things on there before we've come to the new rules. So that's why we're doing the new rules before the Warscrolls.
Fair enough. Yeah. Obviously, GW has introduced them sometimes at the same time to kind of guide us into it or ease us into it. But I think a lot of our listeners, if they're anything like me, have been keeping up with a number of the YouTube channels coverage and also reading the articles themselves. So I'm going to kind of assume that people haven't read everything in the way that I present it. But at the same time, I don't want to just talk at you guys as if you haven't read it. So we're going to try to cover the basics, but then go into deeper stuff and add our perspective on things that maybe haven't been mentioned in as many of the YouTube videos out there already.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the models.
Yeah, here's the rough part, right? So like we posted our last video. I remember, Jonas, you were saying as we made the video, oh, it's up to date, and we're on it. We left on a really good note. I think the last one was like the regiment formation, and it was so positive. And then I said, you asked me what time should I publish it tomorrow, and I said, well, the new articles usually come out around 2:00 in European Central Time. So like, what does that make that? Like 8 a.m. in the States, and in the East Coast. And I said, yeah, maybe just try to post it by 12 so that it feels like it's the first thing in the day. And then obviously the very next thing that happened was the squatting article. And God, I have to think it sucked a lot of the air out of the room from our video. Not that everyone was going to watch our video, but more that we'd made this real positive video, and then all of a sudden, all the air got sucked out of the room because it was just this depressing day.
Yeah, I remember me telling you that I might buy the core set just to have another Stormcast edition to my army, but I have no Stormcast army anymore, so...
Oh, God. Yeah. Well, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because it's been talked in the ground already. Yeah. And I want to maybe do a couple like quick just some summaries of what's like been said and what we know about what's coming along about the squatted stuff. So Vince covered this really well on Warhammer Weekly. Also the Stormkeep, the Stormcast dedicated channel, covered it really well too. So I would reference people to go listen to those things, Haywo, other sources for more takes on this. We're not going to go into full detail, but just some reminders. The things that are going to get free to download battle tomes are Beasts of Chaos, Bone Splitters, some of the Stormcast, which will be just the Sacrosanct stuff, and plus some of the stuff that doesn't get new models or rejuvenated models. They're all going to be legal until summer of 2025, and then go to Legends. The Warcry and Underworld Warband stuff from like Slaves to Darkness are going straight to Legends, and with quote unquote many more Underworld's Warbands remaining on sale, but supported only by Digital Legends Warscrolls in the next edition, which makes me think that even though Underworld stuff will still be on sale for Underworlds, it won't be usable in AOS, but we'll have to see.
Yeah.
And then about the Stormcast stuff, and like maybe it's better to say first about the Skaven, is that the vast majority of the Skaven models are going to be replaced, and their Warscrolls aren't going away. They're just being rejuvenated as models and then rewritten as Warscrolls, as is the case for most of the Warscrolls. If I had to guess which old things are definitely going away, I'd say Giant Rats and Rat Swarms, because they belong more in an old world kind of setting. They're kind of ugly models. And maybe some of the weapons teams, we already know about that one leaked weapons team thing, and I don't know if they're going to have every one of the weapons teams still possible. We know Giselles are definitely coming, but the rest of whatever does get squatted will go to Legends. So in thinking about how they're handling the Skaven, it's easy to say that the Stormcast stuff will fall into one of a couple channels or like categories. One is likely going to be just models that are definitely getting replaced, like the Skaven, like Liberators and Prosecutors, we already know from the release trailer and or other articles. And then some combination of maybe some of the things that weren't mentioned alongside with the Sacrosanct Chamber. This is one thing I haven't heard many people mention, is that most GW did this really poorly, I think, for multiple reasons. But one thing they did that I think they should have been more aware of is that most of us that play the game, when we saw which of these models got squatted, thought these are the units that are going away. But a lot of those Stormcast units are only half represented in the slides. For example, the Knight Azeros, the one with the wings, the hero with the wings, has a complementary model called the Knight Venator, which they didn't list. But that's because GW is almost definitely thinking these are the kits we're discontinuing. And then they didn't bother to mention that it has 2 Warscrolls associated with it. Yeah. Same thing with like the guy writing the Toralon. They mentioned the named version, but not the generic version. But clearly the generic version is also going away. There are a couple Stormcast heroes that weren't mentioned that there's some question marks behind, but we'll leave that for we'll wait and see.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the other things that's really rough is that they're squatting so many of the Slaves to Darkness Warcry warbands, in some of which are really young, and they're leaving the Legionnaires and Dark Oath Savagers a little bit weird. Godsworn Hunt and Gnarl Spirit Pack are question marks. We don't know what they're doing with them. So this is a feel bad for a lot of people, especially that we're thinking like these are battle line and they're spammable. And there were some people that were doing the snake one, Splintered Fang, like tons of Splintered Fangs. So who knows? Evidently, they're not even going to be available in Warcry anymore, which is a feel bad. So
yeah, and I think with the deleted Stormcast models, I mean, I know this isn't a popular opinion, and I hope you accept that it's coming from a guy who's seen his complete High Elf army being squatted at the start of Age of Sigmar. So I have some experience in getting your favorite army squatted or something like that. But Stormcast, my usual opponent plays Stormcast a lot, and I told him what I'm going to tell you guys now. He has a bunch of Evocators, for example, and both he and I really dislike the other monstrous mount units. What are they called again? Tempestors, for example.
Yeah. Protein Guard.
Yeah. I mean, you could really easily replace those models. Maybe swap some weapons around, and that would totally work, because a lot of Stormcast units look alike. And they're all golden and they're all armored and you see very little faces. And so a lot of stuff works, but I still get the major disappointment of having your models, removed or being taken away. But from a Stormcast perspective, not only will a lot of things get replaced, as you mentioned, but you can still really, Sequitors, they look like Liberators. You could totally play them as Liberators, I think. But that's much harder for the warbands, right?
Depending on what happens with all the Dark Oath stuff, like how strict people are about you must use the actual Dark Oath models that are about to come out. But obviously, and then that's a nice way to be able to discern between different units, at least, right? Fair. Like sometimes if you bring hordes of things, it's really hard to tell where one unit starts and the other one ends, whatever, the other way around. And so maybe, here's my one unit that just happens to be Splintered Fang models, but they count as Marauders. And then here's this other unit that is Godsworn Hunt or whatever, that kind of thing. But no, I mean, this is just copium or whatever, trying to make people feel better about something they shouldn't have had to experience in the first place. Let's be honest. Yeah. GW just handled it really poorly. But it's still a step up for GW in a weird way, because they're giving people a year. And I guess there's also the whole meme of go play Old World, which I don't have a problem with, because they already squatted my whole, well, not my whole, but a good chunk of my city's army before I knew that they were going to be an Old World. So I just saw it as like an extra benefit. But I understand why it's kind of the GW version of learn to code, that meme.
Yeah.
It's like, here, go do something you don't want to do, and then you should just feel better because we tell you to. But I do think there's a chance that Sacrosanct is going to be reborn at some point. This is a bit of hopium, but I do think there's a chance that they'll come back in another wave, and that you could maybe use those old models at something. But I wouldn't hold out hopes for that. But there's a part of me that deep down thinks that might be a thing, because it's kind of insane that they cut that many of the not so old models, and those Kitty Caters are great models. The guys writing the Dracolites. But anyway, let's not talk this one into the ground, because it's already been done.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move on to the new models.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. So yeah, we've got more than just this, I guess. But I guess last time we covered the Liberators. So we've got the new Stormcast model. That was the first thing, or maybe that was the second thing. We had the Clan Rats, which you see in the bottom right corner there. We got the new Stormcast unit. It's the only one of these that's actually a new unit, like as in never had a War Scroll before. It's a new type of Paladin kind of unit that is more elite, and they've got those cool little cities guys following them around. I'm calling them cities guys because they're clearly normal humans.
Cities guys, yeah.
Yeah. But you know what I mean. They could have been in a cities army.
Totally.
And evidently they're the ones keeping their souls tethered to the earth, which is really neat lore. Yeah. I don't know how they're going to play in game. It looked from the unit that you have 3 of these guys and 2 of the little priest guys that hang out with them. If that's how the unit is sold. So I don't know how that works. And if they fight or they just stand there, and who knows. But they look real cool. That said, I think the little guys look cooler than the Stormcast, because Stormcast still manages to kind of just look like slight upgrades of each other every time they come out, in my personal opinion. But at least it's a new unit. So we've seen a new. We haven't seen the Warscroll yet, but we do know that the unit is new.
We are going to reach a point where a Stormcast infantry model is just completely the same as a hero, right? You can't upgrade these guys much further before you reach hero look status.
Sure. Yeah. I think you're totally on the nose with that one. So, yeah, and because this guy doesn't look that different from the first, like the original launch box from first edition Heroes.
Yeah. He looks better than first edition Heroes.
Sure.
Which is probably why they're going away.
Yeah. Well, they're not getting rid of them. They're getting rid of the second edition Heroes, but fair yes. Yeah. A large chunk of them. Okay. So the Skaven clan rats, I'm a Skaven player myself. They do look better, but so marginally better, in my humble opinion, that I'm not really that enthused about it. I mean, they're obviously coming in the launch box, but like, I don't need a whole lot of Skaven clan rats unless they just for some reason become amazing. So yeah. I'll definitely paint some up, or I'll sell them off, one or the other, but not that enthused about it.
They're a bit more dynamic, I guess, but it's not a huge difference, especially when you see the side-by-side on a GW website with the old models. I think if you show that picture to an experienced player, he wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
I mean, they're yeah. I mean, like, the problem with hordes, and they've said this in other channels too, is that hordes are implicitly not supposed to be individuals.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so you don't want them to have too much detail for how much you have to put out to paint them, but also, like, they fade into each other when they're on the table.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, who cares? That's why the other ones are so easy to, compare to these, is because, yeah, this guy's a little more active with his bell. The flag's definitely a little bit better, but like at the end of the day, from a distance, they all kind of look the same. And then we got the new Warlock Engineer. What do you think of this model? I've heard both sides of this argument.
I really like it a lot. It looks so good. I love the simple hero models. Sometimes they can be over the top, and that's fine for some of them. But this is a guy that you're gonna duplicate maybe sometimes. So I love the simplicity. It's like a little bit steampunky. I especially adore the painting style. There's so much erosion on the weapons and on the stuff on the ground. Yeah, it's really good. I love it.
Yeah, I think he's cool. I'm eager to see what they do. I'm more concerned about the rule stuff with these kinds of things, but I already have 2 of these guys, and they actually come in blister packs. If you buy the current metal versions, they come in blister packs of 2. So I accidentally bought 2 blister packs thinking that I was getting 2 models, but I got 4 instead. So I've got way too many of these guys already. I'm never going to need, like, it probably comes in the launch box, so I'll have 5 at that point. I guess I'll paint this guy up and use him as my dude instead of the old models, but I'm not afraid of using old models for their current rules,
Yeah, you shouldn't be. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Let's get into the meaty stuff.
Sure. So we got a lot of new rules. You've got them listed here in order that's kind of logically arranged here. We're talking about commands and command points. Then the new guarded hero rule, which is one of the more recent rules we've gotten. Battle traits and formations, which is like sub-faction type stuff, and then army stuff backwards. Combat rules. Obviously that's the meat, the bread and butter of the game. And then obviously the controversial magic and prayers section. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you think about all this. I guess let's take a look at the commands pages we made here.
Yeah.
So there's as far as the way command points work, they've structured it as though it's very different. But I want to make an argument after laying down the basics for why it's not actually that different. So let's just read through the bullet points real quick. All command points have this symbol, and then that is rules text bold a command. Each player gains 4 command points at the start of each battle round. So not each turn, but each battle round. The underdog gains 1 extra command point. That's if you at the end of the last battle round had less points than the opponent. You get 1 extra command point. If you have the same, no one gets it. Each unit can only use 1 command in each phase. That's as it's always been. Each command can only be used one time by each army in each phase. That's also the same. And you must pay the command point cost to use a command. Nothing is different there, except for the underdog thing, really. And we're starting with 4 command points. Now, I made a point in my kind of like notes about this, that they keep talking about how much more restricted the command point system is. But let me like lay down the case here that it's not actually radically different. How does it work now? Beginning of a battle round, you all receive the player going first receives 1 CP and then 1 for their general, and the other player receives 2 CP and 1 for the general. So it's 2 or 3, and then your own turn. Let's assume your general's living. You get another CP. So that means instead of 2 or 3, it's 3 or 4. And then let's say every turn you do your heroic action that gives you a CP on a 4-up. You do 2 attempts. That means at 50% chance, on average, you get 1. So we're going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, now 4 to 5. The average player using the heroic action every turn and having their general on the field is getting 4 to 5 CPs in a normal game as it is now. There are plenty of armies that don't have any other reliable way of generating CPs. There are, of course, armies that do. So those are obviously getting a cut here. But now the new system is you get 4 for sure, regardless of whether you do a heroic action. You don't get any more on your second turn. Like there's no, because your general's on the field. So you just get them right off the bat. And then if you're the underdog, you might get an extra one. So that'd be 4 or 5. And if you have less auxiliary units than your opponent, which has to do with list building, which I expect in competitive games is going to be relatively not an issue, but we'll see, then you could be getting as many as 6. So it's not, for some armies, it's actually more than they would get in the current version of the game. The big difference being that, as we'll see, there are some commands that cost more than 1 command. Thus far, we've only seen 1 command point. We've only seen 1 command that does that. That would be the countercharge rule. We'll probably see some other command abilities in the game that require more than 1, but thus far haven't. And so, yes, in a sense, that does eat up more of your CP. But I'm not seeing it as restrictive as a lot of people are painting it to be, unless you were an army such as OBR that obviously used a lot of CPs. But then they went on to say OBR is going to make up for this and go somehow compensate for how they used to play. So they're going to be getting some version of, let's say you issue a command and 3 units can use it or something. Who knows? So maybe that's breaking what GW means by saying there's no other way to get extra commands. Or maybe they meant it just literally you don't get extra command points. No one gets those. Who knows? Jonas, what do you think about that assessment? Do you play a lot of armies that get a lot more CPs?
If you bring a Slan and Croak, you usually get a couple. But with my Lumineth, I'm always short on CP. I completely agree with your assessment. It's very fair to say that it's on par with what general armies are getting right now, like the armies without any other ways to gain CP, and in some cases might actually be even more if you're thinking about being the underdog. If you're suffering through the double turn of your opponent, you get an extra CP. And I also think you get 1 extra for having less auxiliary units, right?
Yeah, I said that one. Yeah. It might have fell through the cracks there, but yes. Yeah. That said, we don't know how the auxiliary structure is going to work. There's one image of the game where we can imagine that in those regiments that you bring with each hero, that every single non-hero unit can be matched up with a hero and therefore could go in a regiment. That's one interpretation of what's going to happen. We don't know. There's another interpretation that says a good chunk of the units will be able to go into the regiments of at least specific heroes, but there are going to be some units that absolutely have to be taken as auxiliary.
Yeah.
And because auxiliary also determines your drops and it might give extra CPs to your opponent, I expect that people are going to try not to do that, which might be, unfortunately, I hope they don't go this route, but it might be a way that GW effectively turns off the competitive use of some specific units that never got bundled with a hero.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's a real bummer. Like, let's say, as someone who's playing 4 Warp Lightning Cannons in a list and having a blast doing it, you'd think that they'd be able to be taken alongside a Scryer hero because they're Scryer units. But let's say that they count as auxiliary. And then if I want to take 4, I'm automatically giving my opponent extra CP every battle round, and I'm probably losing the drops. That kind of sucks. So I'm really hoping that most units are, at least most, if not all, are paired with a specific hero. But until we learn more about it, we're just going to have to speculate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So is there anything I missed in the right-hand column here? Less CP, fewer ways to gain, 10 generic command. That's worth mentioning.
Yeah, we're going through those now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, and then we talked about the underdog suffering and everything.
Yeah.
Okay. So using abilities, they've got a new system that people have likened to the way Magic the Gathering does the stack, which is basically that we have specific steps that things have to happen in. They've already told us that everything that happens in the game, from moving to shooting to actually things that we currently call abilities, are now defined as abilities, and they'll all go through all 3 of these steps. It's real simple, but basically you say that you're going to do it. People have the chance to use reactions. That's including yourself reacting to your own thing. And then once everyone says, I'm done with reacting, you resolve it in some order. I don't know if it's ever going to get as complicated as the stack is in Magic, which has very explicit rules about first in, last out, that kind of thing. But it's at least a way for them to line things up in a way that I think makes it easier to rule on what should happen with certain rules interactions. I'm sure they'll probably even have a priority system for whose reactions go first. So if it's your turn and you both have to react to your declaration of an ability, then maybe the active player's reactions go first and then the other person's. Who knows? We'll have to see what they say, but I have a feeling that's where we're headed. So yeah. And the design, as you mentioned here, is for more interactive play.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's look at those commands.
Sure. So these are the ones that are basically identical.
Yeah, now, that's why I included them on this slide specifically.
Exactly. What you'll see is that everything's color coded, and we've had confirmation that the color coding that we were talking about was not associated with the modules as we once speculated, but it was associated with their own color coding system, which has to do with in which phase they occur or what type of ability they are. I'll admit, I have not learned the colors yet, but I don't know if I'm really ever going to pay too much attention to it. As you can see here with All Out Attack in red, it's a reaction after you declared an attack ability. All of these you can see in the little gem in the upper right-hand corner cost 1 CP. We've got a little flavor text, as always, in italics. It delineates who it's used by, so the unit using that attack ability, and then it has an effect. Add 1 to hit rolls for attacks made as part of that attack ability. This also affects weapons that have the companion weapon ability. This is great because we've had a problem with Warscrolls trying to delineate between the difference between mounts, companions, crew, and maybe there was another option, and they got super muddy what was what, and then they had to go back and FAQ things. So it looks like from the Warscrolls we've seen, like with the Stormstrike Chariot, that the Gryph-hounds that are on the chariot, driving the chariot, are listed as companions, which previously they would have been called mounts, and now we're just everything's companion, and there's no question that this ability also affects their to hit rolls. So it's just gotten more specific, and that's great. Who doesn't like clear rules? Let's see. If we're looking at all of these and just quickly scanning them, you'll see that every single one of them has a used by and an effect, but none of them say anything about declaring, apart from what it says in the top section above. Some of them, though, have a declare that's in the main box, and we'll see that later. All Out Defense, I'll just go ahead and say, is exactly the same, and it can be used in any phase now, by the way. It says opponent declared an attack ability. So currently, All Out Defense in 3rd edition can only be used in the shooting phase and in the combat phase. But now, because they haven't locked it to either one of those phases and have made it more broad, it can now be used in, say, the hero phase if someone for some reason gets to attack you in the hero phase. So that's kind of nice. And now there'll be no gotcha moments. I've seen a couple people during a hero phase attack that say, oh, I want to use All Out Defense, or I want to use redeploy or whatever. And this is one of those things where it now has been clarified that you can use it whenever. Yeah. At the double, same thing. You're just re-rolling, or you're instead of making a run roll, you are adding 6 inches. And just this is also how it works now, but just know that if you have any modifier because you're no longer rolling or you're not rolling anymore in the current version of the game without the double either, you don't do 6 inches plus your modifier. It's just a flat 6. And then forward to victory is whenever you declare charge ability. Now, we were just talking about this before we went on the video, that when they originally released this article, it wasn't clear that whether you would have to declare that you were going to use this before you'd committed to rolling that charge roll. That's what it looks like on this. But as we'll see from the charge ability later, it says that in the declare step of a charge ability, that's when you roll the 2d6. And if you remember the order, there's declare and then there's reactions. And so you would have rolled already and then you get to do this reaction. So it's clear now. But at the time of the article getting published, people thought maybe it's more risky now to commit to that command ability. So any comments on these, Jonas?
No, you've covered it all.
Pretty straightforward.
I'm more looking forward to the new ones. Yeah,
for sure. I'm a big fan, but I wasn't blown away by this article because I think people were blowing them out of proportion. But we'll have to see once we actually get some games under our fingers.
Yeah.
So starting upper left-hand corner, we got Rally. It says any hero phase, which is just as it is now. It's also a friendly unit that is not in combat. I love that they've also defined combat as being in combat is currently in 3rd edition, not actually a known entity. They've previously or currently still refer to it as being within 3 inches.
Yeah.
But now in combat is 3 inches. And by the way, that is also the wording for if you're within 3 inches of a friendly unit. But anyway, instead of how Rally used to work, where you'd roll a die for each slain model, and then every 6 or whatever the Rally roll was, you would get a model back, and then it got FAQ'd to with a maximum total wounds cap of 10. So if they had wounds characteristic 2, then you could only get max 5 back. Now you're rolling 6 Rally rolls of a d6. For each 4+, you receive a Rally point, and they can be spent modularly with any combination of the following: either healing 1, you'll see keyword in brackets here 1, which is pretty cool because obviously that means that there's going to be some heal 2s or heal 3s, heal D3s in other places to that unit. Or you can spend a number of Rally points equal to the health characteristic of that unit to return a slain model. You can spend the Rally points in any combination above. Unspent Rally points are then lost, so they don't get saved for later. The beautiful thing about this, at least as it currently is stated, is in almost every instance of a GW rule that I've ever seen, I don't play 40K, so maybe it's there, but you can't bring a slain model back to a unit if one of the models still has wounds on them. But this doesn't say anything about that. So unless that's somewhere in the core rules, it means you can flexibly say, well, my unit has a wounds characteristic of 2, and if I only get 1 out of this, then clearly I'm just going to heal the 1 unit that maybe they've already got on them. But if I happen to get a multiple of 2, I'll just bring full models back. And currently, that's what you could do. If you rolled 4 4+, then you could bring 2 models back to that unit of Liberators instead of worrying about healing that 1.
Yeah,
I said model, but now the whole unit takes the damage. So it's kind of interesting. I also wonder how this will work with contagion points or disease points, whatever they're called, disease points on models from Nurgle, assuming Nurgle still has that mechanic. Because right now you have to choose between healing or taking a disease point off. And now this seems like it might be able to do a combination of whatever you think's nice. I'll heal 1, I'll take a disease point off, I'll bring a model back. Maybe you can mix and match. So what do you think about the new Rally rule?
I like it. It's important to remember that. I mean, maybe you mentioned it, but it kind of replaces the heroic recovery as well, right?
Yeah, they've said heroic actions are completely gone. Yeah. So unless they give heroes another way to heal, you're going to have to choose between rallying a unit of like a unit of multiple models or whatever, and healing your hero or monster or whatever it is. But it also gives you a way to heal monsters that like non-hero monsters. They had no way of doing that, or artillery or whatever.
Yeah. And
pretty nice.
You're gonna return a couple of models more easily, but they're never gonna be huge models, which I think is great because seeing a dragon return, for example, on a Stormdrake Guard was never really a fun experience.
Yeah.
And I do also like that it is easier to return smaller-ish models like Stormcast units, for example, or just Horde units, because with the new rules for retreating, which we'll cover in a bit, you're going to lose some of those models more easily, but you'll get them back as more easily as well.
Yeah, and I also I'm definitely going to do a video on the math of rally because it's actually really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the maybe easiest points is I wrote this up in our little notes is if you previously, let's say you had a concussor die or one of those Dracoth Guard die in Stormcast that has 6 wounds. I think they have 6. If they die and you lost 1 and you tried to rally it, obviously there's a chance of bringing that full 6 wounds worth of guy back on 1 out of 6 chance. You roll a 6. And so maybe you think it's worth taking that chance. But now you need to roll exactly 6 4 pluses, which only happens 1.56% of the time. It's like 10 times worse than what it used to be. So like you said, trying to bring back a big model, even one of only 6 wounds, our health is actually pretty rough now.
Yeah, you're not going to see a lot of Croxy Gore or dragons returning,
No. Well, dragons not at all. So,
yeah. Yeah, I mean the Drake thingies.
Yeah. Which one do you want to talk about next?
Let's cover redeploy first because I think the changes to redeploy are very, very interesting. Mainly because it just happens at the end. So yeah, go for it.
Okay, and so something I haven't mentioned, and they don't have written here, but they did say in the core rules, it's going to say that all of these commands are used, that these types, not the all-out defense type, has to be used at the end of that phase. So the rally is at the end, but that was always kind of the case. Well, no, it was at the start of, actually. And then enemy movement phase, this is at the end of the enemy movement phase. After, it's no longer reactive to someone moving within a 9-inch bubble.
Yeah.
It's just pick a friendly unit of yours in the enemy movement phase that's not in combat, so not within 3 inches. And each model in that unit can move up to D6 inches. And that move cannot pass through or end within the combat range of an enemy unit. This is keyworded as a move and a run. Now, there's so many little details in here that I think are worth mentioning. One, of course, you're more flexible to pick any unit that's not in combat to just move D6. Now, you don't know how much that D6 roll is going to be. So there's some tactical variance there, but there's also some swinginess. Another thing is it says that unit cannot pass through or end within the combat range of an enemy unit. But currently, if a unit has flying, it could do that. And I think this is going to overwrite that because flying is a core rule, and then this is a specific rule which is going to overwrite that. Now, granted, moving only D6 inches is not usually enough to get a flying unit around for it to really be a problem, but that is maybe a point of interest. And then probably the most important thing is that it's stuck with the run keyword, which means a lot of people were saying, well, I could probably redeploy and then I could do covering fire or I could do a counter charge. But it's written in the rules that you can't shoot or charge if you've made a run move. So this counts as a run, even though it's a redeploy. Now, it was always that way with redeploy with Unleash Hell, that you couldn't redeploy and then Unleash Hell. But we never had a charge ability that was, well, for the most part, that was bound with this. There's some armies that can countercharge. And so now these are not comboable, if you will. You're not going to redeploy with a unit and then be shooting with it and then charging with it in the enemy phases, unless there's an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about redeploy you thought was particularly worth bringing up?
Yeah, it's just an interesting change, that it has to happen at the end of the phase instead of a trigger. It is harder for the active player now to kind of force a trigger earlier than you would normally want it to be triggered, because usually when you play around, you want to charge a unit, you bring them in close and you're kind of almost taunting your opponent with smaller units first. Like, please do use redeploy so I can at least put my other units that I actually want to charge with as close as possible. So now that's definitely going to happen at the end of the turn. But having said that, you can also not use it before that. So you're as an active player, you have an easier time surrounding your opponent now as well. So that's an interesting change, I think.
Yeah, and it's going to definitely a lot of these rules that we're going to see are streamlining the amount of time it's going to take to play the game. And I think one of those little things here is, like we said last time, every time I move a unit within 9 and they haven't redeployed yet, I ask them, "Do you want to redeploy?"
Yeah.
So now I'm not going to ask that anymore, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's cool from a thematics standpoint that you can actually surround a unit more easily now, and you're caught out by the enemy's movement, which I think is very cool.
Yeah, obviously by surrounding them enough that they can't move, you're also enabling them to have a good counter charge.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a trade-off there. Depends on what kind of unit you're trying to keep from moving. Probably has more to do with jumping on objectives and getting to certain parts of the board. But then again, the objectives are a lot smaller now. So, who knows? Maybe they're easier to keep people away from. But
yeah. A thing that just occurred to me about rally and not redeploy, if you're okay with moving back to rally for a bit, there is nothing in that command ability that says you can't return the model into combat, right?
No, I mean, there might be something in the core rules, but no. Well, it does say not in combat. The unit
you have to
combat.
start out of combat, but then if let's say you're 4 inches away and you return a model and you place that model within 3 inches, it doesn't specifically say you can't do that here. Maybe it'll be in the core rules that when you're returning models, you also have to place them outside of combat or something like that.
But, it's kind of like they say if you bring a model back to a unit that's got recursion, it has to be within 1 inch of an original model in the unit. I think that's written more in an FAQ or something somewhere, but who knows? Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to covering fire.
All right, this is the one everyone was freaking out about, but then once we got more information. First off, for the record, I never was freaking out about it back when it came out. But then once we found out, spoiler alert, you can't shoot while you're in combat at all, unless you have the shoots in combat rule, which probably the best shooting units won't have. So considering, let's just first off, what does it allow you to do? It lets you get 1 unit to shoot in the enemy shooting phase and not as a charge reaction per se. In fact, it won't be as a charge reaction because it's at the end of the enemy shooting phase. It's implicitly not even in the charge phase. It's earlier. But basically, that's all it is. A unit that's not in combat gets to resolve shooting attacks at the nearest visible enemy unit with a -1 to hit. It sounds gross, but remember, it has to be done at the end of the enemy shooting phase, which means that the enemy's going to be able to move their whole movement phase. Plus, let's say it was your turn, the person that wants to use this CP, this command ability, during the previous turn, your turn, they had the chance to redeploy with units to move things around. They had the chance to countercharge with units, and then they had their full movement phase, and who knows, maybe magic teleporting and other things in the hero phase. They've had multiple opportunities to move things around before the end of the enemy shooting phases even come, or their shooting phases even come around or whatever. And then they can maybe set up a screening unit. And anyone that's played against Ideneth knows how brutal this can be if you really need to shoot something. Having to shoot the nearest enemy unit, and only 1 unit gets to do it, and you have to put all their attacks into that unit. So they just put some chaffy little thing that's got 1 wound left up in front of it, and then it's just a sacrificial lamb for something way more important.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same you would do with Jesus, what's the name? When you're charging in and you get to fire at the chargers.
Unleash Hell.
Unleash Hell, yeah. So you would normally, if you're afraid of their Unleash Hell, you would normally include a smaller unit that would soak that damage, because you could only shoot at the first guys, right? Because once they got in, you couldn't do Unleash Hell anymore anyway. So now you're probably doing the same thing, but you're just placing them in front of your big monster for a bit so that they're closer.
Exactly. And the other thing to keep in mind, now that we know that you can't shoot, most of the good shooting units probably can't shoot in combat, is that think about the economy of how many turns you have to use. Like whenever I compute how good a unit is in melee, I always when I compute similar scores for how good they are with shooting, I always divide it by 2 or multiply the melee by 2, one or the other, because there are 10 opportunities to fight in combat for most units, assuming you can get in combat in turn 1, but there are only 5 opportunities to shoot.
Yeah.
And let's say that even forgetting that they are saying that shooting range is going to be reduced, which we haven't seen the evidence of yet, but probably will happen. Yes, this is giving one unit an extra chance to shoot at some target not of their choosing, unless they get to teleport or something in the enemy phase, which probably isn't going to happen much. But now, all those turns when someone gets in combat with them, let's say for some reason they're a tanky shooting unit, like dragons, for example. Dragons are relatively tanky, Storm Drake Guard, and they have good shooting attacks. But now they can't even shoot in combat unless it explicitly says, because it's a flame weapon, it can be shot in combat. We'll have to see. But say that that is the unit. Now they lost a whole turn of doing D6 whatever mortal wounds that they could have done.
Mm-hmm.
And so giving that back to them a little bit by letting one unit get to shoot in the enemy shooting phase doesn't seem like that hard of a counter. I mean, like that it's that bad. Like, it actually seems like it's almost making up for the fact that the shooting units are getting nerfed.
Yeah.
Now, I know someone's going to complain, someone that hates shooting in the game, and I'm a person who loves it. It's going to say, Ryan, you're real biased on this. I get it, but I think if we, in the net, how it's going to end up playing out, especially if shooting units don't change all that much from what they currently are, it's going to actually be kind of weak sauce command ability.
Yeah, I was in the camp of being a little worried when I first saw this, but once I knew that there was no shooting in combat anymore for most of the units, I mean, that completely changes the dynamic, right? Especially with the next commands that we're gonna see a little bit further down the slides here. When we get to power through, for example, your shooting users are gonna be so much more vulnerable than they were before. It's easier to be caught out with them. You probably get to shoot less with them throughout an entire game. And they have a shorter range. That's something that they did mention, that the range on all shooting attacks is going to go down, or generally at least. So yeah, that'll be different and interesting.
Yeah, we'll have to see. Like I was mentioning, the only shooting was formerly a shooting profile that we've seen has either stayed the same on the Stormstrike Chariot or on the Warlock Engineer has gotten longer. The one on the Weird Knob Shaman, what used to be a magic spell and was 2d6 inch range or something like that. So it's hard to compare that. But anyway, we don't have any proof that it's gotten shorter with the Warscrolls we've seen, but that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. If it's like less command points, I think we'll be good.
Yeah. Yeah. So there we go. Let's do countercharge real quick, and then we can move on. Countercharge is obviously the only expensive one we've seen thus far. It's like it's permanently total eclipsed. It's the enemy charge phase. This one's pretty brutal. You have to pick a friendly unit that's not in combat, which makes sense because usually you can't charge unless you're not in combat. And then that unit can use a charge ability as if it were charge phase. Granted, this is the end of the enemy charge phase. I made a point in my notes beforehand that this is, I think, the new redeploy, in the sense that redeploy, as you were mentioning, is very sensitive to a 9-inch bubble, right? So what does everyone do if they don't want to trigger redeploy? They stay outside of 9 inches, and you're laying down those 9-inch sticks on the units to make sure that doesn't happen. You're being very clear, this is not redeploy triggerable. I think the new thing that this countercharge is offering is saying, I'm going to try to avoid someone even having the opportunity to countercharge. It's a bit how we handle what's it called? The Blitzkrieg or whatever it's called that the Glockkin can do. I forget, Blightkrieger or something like that. You intentionally stay out of his bubble so that he can't use it. Now, of course, that's a weird trade-off that you're making. But now what you're thinking is, well, maybe if I stay outside of 12 inches, then they can't do it at all. But maybe I'm willing to 10 inches, and then maybe they'll blow 2 CPs to throw it away on something that's statistically not likely to happen, but they have to Hail Mary it or whatever to try to make it happen. Now you're playing with some interplay and some psychology that's kind of interesting. Also, worth pointing out that they've changed the charge rules, that no longer are you limited to only being able to charge within 12 inches. You can initiate a charge that's longer than 12 inches, even if you can't possibly make it. But remember, you can roll, you only have to come in within a half inch, which means if you're just under 12 and a half inches, and you roll a perfect 6-6, you can actually hit that charge now, which is giving an extra half inch. So I suppose that technically being outside of countercharge range would be being, for most units, outside of 12.5 inches now. But in any case, it's kind of similar to the bubble that Redeploy was creating, and then trying to play around the threats that the enemy could be, surprising you with at the end of your own charge phase. Yeah. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in part 1 because we knew that there was going to be something like countercharge. And I did also mention that segment. I don't know where you call that, Ryan, but I did mention that I wish they would vary the cost on command abilities. So I'm really happy there's a 2-point command ability now, because that is such a good way to tackle balance. If it seems too powerful, you increase the value. If it seems too weak, you lower the value. So I love that it costs 2. I really like the idea of having a counter charge. It makes things a little bit more risky. And I remember in our talk there, I mentioned the Legion of Night rules. There's a reason that faction is super popular right now. It's such a powerful tool, the counter charge thing. But I do agree with everything that you've said. I think it's interesting to note as well that if the rules for charging stay the same, like you can't charge after you've ran, you can also not redeploy and then counter charge as well.
Yeah, I mentioned that one a little bit earlier also, with not being comboable with shooting.
The shooting, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's definitely an important thing to note, because everyone's thinking, I'm getting a free redeploy to set up a better charge, and that's just not how that's working. To your point about the CPs, it's now that they're not just uniformly one thing, and we see this also with other abilities in the game, like control scores and stuff like that. It makes me curious if they're going to ever do 0, or if we'll see something higher than 2. So like, I can imagine a CP that is limited to once per turn, but doesn't cost you a resource.
Yeah.
So I could actually see that being a thing that that OBR uses to solve that problem.
Oh yeah, that would make sense. Yeah.
That you can only do it so many times or whatever, but it's free. Or 3, which of course is extremely powerful. I don't even know what 3 would be. Probably that's game breaking, but I'd be curious to see how many more 2s there are, for sure.
I mean, if you think about the what's it called, the Seraphon one, it's not a command ability, but it costs 5 cosmic power points, 15 cosmic power points, sorry, where you're dealing D3 mortal wounds to everything within range. They could just as easily make that into a command ability you get to use once you reach a certain amount of cosmic power points, for example, if they're still keen on using that kind of currency, I guess.
Sure.
And make that cost like a huge amount of your investment for command points.
Sure. Yeah, maybe cost 3 or 4. Yeah.
Right. So we've got magical intervention and power through.
Yeah. Okay. So also 2 new ones, and that aren't replacing anything that we've currently had. So end of enemy hero phase, we got magical intervention. What is it? What are people calling it? There was an unleash spell, which was the joke for that one.
Yeah.
Basically, they've really, we'll see this in the magic discussion, but they've really streamlined how wizards and priests work, and they have a lot more overlap in certain senses and a lot more differences in other senses. But now we're seeing that they both kind of get to wield this similarly. You pick a wizard or priest. It doesn't say that they have to be outside of combat. So a lot of the other abilities did say that. That friendly unit can use a spell or prayer ability as appropriate, as if it were your own hero phase. If you do so, subtract 1 from casting rolls or chanting rolls. Okay. So I don't remember exactly what the wording on Nagash's spell said, but or any of the other spells, but I'm wondering, I have a feeling that it said in your hero phase, and I wonder if, I'm assuming that this is overriding because it says as if it were your, but I wonder if there's any that are going to say you can't use magical intervention for this. Like they're so powerful or broken to use it in your turn. I'm curious to see if there's any interaction on that end. And then obviously -1 to casting roll can be brutal. It really depends on the 2d6 distribution, which I'll cover in a Math Hammer video once I get around to it. -1 has bigger it has bigger implications in different places of where you needed your roll to meet. So like -1 if you needed a 4 is not so bad, but -1 if you needed an 8 is pretty rough.
Yeah.
Enchanting rolls is interesting. We'll get into this later, but just real quick to say, I don't know if this is going to mean that it reduces if it's unmodified or not for your chanting roll, and we'll talk about that implication later. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about magical intervention, especially as a Magic player yourself?
Yeah, obviously I love it. It makes so much sense, if everyone's got time to, knock their arrow and unleash a shot at an enemy, then why wouldn't a spellcaster be able to cast an arcane bolt, for example? So yeah, it makes sense. As you mentioned, it kind of depends on how strong certain spells are going to be. I guess it can be quite risky. I just really love the flexibility here as well, because sometimes you kind of just forget on what unit you're going to put a spell or wanted to put a spell on, or something like Mystic Shield, for example. You could now save it for your enemy hero phase and at least use it on a unit where you're thinking like, okay, they're still full health and they're probably going to get into combat now. So that is interesting. I think, I really like this. It for casting, it seems totally fine. For the chanting, it's as you say, if it lowers their chance to or increases their chance of rolling a 1, and it counts for mischanting, let's call it that for a second. That's going to be brutal.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later, but I do think it has some implications.
Yeah.
The other thing that's nice about this is that it's one of the only ways you can better guarantee that a wizard's actually within range for a spell. Right? Because that's one of the biggest problems. You go first with the magic army and your damage kind of Zinchi army, you're probably not in range to do any of your best spells. But after one turn's worth of moving, and at the end of the enemy hero phase, they haven't had many chances, some chances, but not many to move at that point. Yep. And then now you probably can set up that spell. Of course, you can only do it once, but it's giving you one more than you previously had, especially if you didn't have Portal, right? So
and we'll it's also interesting, since this will happen at the end of the hero phase, the active player always has to keep in mind that magical intervention can still happen. So we'll have to save a power point, or whatever it's called, a power level, to save an unbind, for example, in case they need it. So that's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's definitely something different than what we've had before.
Yeah. The thing about power levels is something magic-y, and we'll get to into that at a later point here, and we'll mention this interaction again.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to power through, because we're more than 50 minutes in and we're still on commands.
We knew this was going to happen.
Yep.
A lot of the channels are covering things as they come out, but with our schedules, it just hasn't worked out that way. So we're trying to be as thorough as we can, and maybe we can get them out a little faster, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so power through, end of any turn. So this one's both sides' turns. The trick here, though, is that sounds real generous, but you have to pick a friendly unit that charged this turn, meaning you can, of course, do it at the end of your turn, but if you want to do it at the end of your opponent's turn, you have to have also used countercharge. So that's a 3 CP investment to make that happen, assuming there's no other abilities that let you charge in your opponent's turn. And keep in mind, you've only got like 4 to 6 CPs, so you're already using 3/4 to half, depending on what you got, to make this possible. But so you've got what you got to do. You pick that unit that made it charge this turn, and then you pick an enemy unit in combat with that unit to be the target. So that means you couldn't have wiped them off the face of the board by charging that turn. And that unit has to have a lower health characteristic than the unit that's using this ability. So obviously we've got this arms race. Like Nagash had 18 health. That means even though he's not the fastest guy on the planet or the most likely to see as a power through kind of guy, he can probably power through almost anything in the game, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I would have thought this would be more of like a brute force, like kind of an ogre charge kind of thing, but he's bigger than the ogres probably, even the Beast Claw guys with 18 wounds. We'll see. But that's interesting that they can't do it to him, even though you'd think maybe they could.
Yeah.
It inflicts D3 mortal damage. I'm going to have to get used to I'm so used to calling mortal wounds. There's no plural for damage, so it's going to not roll off the tongue as easily for me. But D3 mortal damage, and then the unit can move a distance up to its move characteristic. So obviously, if you have a big move characteristic, like I'm imagining Severeth, that's insane.
Yeah.
You can pass through and end the move within the combat ranges of enemy units that you were already in combat with, but not with other enemies. So you can't move into combat with someone else or even fly through. It's turning that off. And it does not have to end the move in combat, which is very Severeth-esque. So this is obviously super powerful. And in a certain sense, I think this rule is more powerful than countercharge for many situations.
Yeah.
Forget the mortal wounds. It's just board control.
It's
putting
crazy.
your unit somewhere you want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But of course, all you have to meet a whole bunch of conditions, and who knows if you're going to be able to meet those. So, yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, you don't actually have to power through. You could also just power back.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people don't really think about that at first glance, because it was included in an article about a chariot, and obviously you see chariots running through that. But, you know, just think about like Dawn Riders or any weaker cavalry units. You charge into something, you deal some damage, you deal something back, and you feel like, okay, this combat isn't going my way, and I still want to capture that objective in the back there that I just left. You just power on, you just use power through, you deal an extra D3 mortal damage, and then you retreat and just end up on your objective anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty strong. Yeah, imagine where you were standing was only 3 inches away. Almost any unit could do that.
Yeah,
like with their movement.
It's like when you see no take backsies. This says the opposite. Like, yes, take backsies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's interesting here is it doesn't say that you get to make a normal move. It says a move equal to your move characteristic. So assuming that the normal move characteristic or that wording is still in the game, a unit that has like fly over mortal wounds, like a boat or something that does mortal wounds when it flies over, won't probably be triggering it anymore. So you're not going to double up on mortal damage you're doing.
Yeah.
As this happens.
But you could also do it with a smaller unit, like a 2 health units, like Blade Lords, for example, fighting some zombies. You cut through a bunch of zombies, and you're like, okay, now we're moving back 6 inches. Whoops, deal D3 mortal damage, and you're back out of combat.
Yeah. I mean, it's super strong, especially for that sort of tactical consideration.
Yeah, and you got to remember, Blood Knights have something like this already on their Warscroll, and it's really fun to use. It's
Yeah.
The thing is, you use it. I think you use it in the movement phase, and it feels a little bit weird. The interaction is also very poorly written, and they had to FAQ it a couple of times. But at the end of the turn, or any turn, makes so much more sense, and it's much more. It's easier to benefit from it, I think, because you can do all your shenanigans and then end your move where you kind of want to end.
How much do you think this is going to create, like I was referencing, an arms race? If you're really trying to turn off someone's power through options, of you say, well, now I'm going to use units with more wounds, a higher health characteristic, just to prevent that from happening.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a disadvantage for chaff units, right? Because they're almost exclusively 1 health models. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, they can't also. They can still use it if they're in combat with a chaff unit and a bigger unit. So if you want to disable this ability, it's as you say, you can only be in combat with a bigger unit. Let's put it that way, or a more healthy unit, literally.
Right, healthy, yeah. Sturdy boys.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to move on to battle traits and formations?
Yes, please. Let's.
Okay, so this has been a point of some consternation in our Discord, and I understand it. I understand it. Look,
same.
I started playing in 2nd edition when cities really felt like every city was a totally different army. When slaves, every one of their sub-factions had a totally separate army, kind of like how the dynasties are in Soulblight right now, which is one of the only factions that really kind of still feels that way, where each sub-faction feels like a totally different army. And I get the flavor stuff. I get people wanting to feel like their sub factions mean something. Apparently, sub factions don't mean anything anymore. Like they're just now, which is bummer. They're being replaced with these formations, battle formations, and like you said here, they're more generic. They're included in the faction packs. Who knows if we'll get more, but they did guarantee that every single army in the indexes is getting 4. We saw 2 examples of Stormcast ones, and then all of the battle traits, which we'll get onto in a second. But let's not move on too fast. What are your other thoughts about the replacements for sub factions?
Yeah, so the discussion that we had in the Discords, to put it briefly, was that by replacing sub-factions with formations, you're losing a lot of flavor from your army, as you mentioned. A lot of fluff is getting a little bit lost, I guess, because obviously I'm always referring to Lumineth, but if your nations are no longer your sub-factions, then it's now like their battle formations, like a Venari battle formation or something like that. It doesn't really feel like you're playing in the worlds anymore necessarily. I think that was kind of the point, and then it was people took it too far, I think, but the point still stands, and I do agree with that point a little bit. But I've been in this hobby for a long time, and this is also an argument that I made in the Discords. They did the same thing with 40k. I think they went back on it a couple editions later, but I didn't necessarily mind it as much that they made the sub-factions more generic, because it did allow me as a creative player to make up stories about my own army. While now, every time that I'm running my Stone Guards, I feel bad that they're not in Zytrek, that they're not in Ymetrica, for example, because it just feels almost an obligatory fluff choice, And I kind of like that it doesn't have to be that way, though I do suspect that a lot of sub-factions will just be references to places in the world where they fight a specific way, and they'll just not be places anymore. But I can still imagine a Lumineth sub-faction just be like an Alarith formation or something like that. And then you'll still feel bad, of course, for not using your Alarith units in an Alarith formation. But
Sure.
Overall, it kind of takes away the fluff pressure, which has downsides and upsides. Overall, I'm not too bothered by it. If it doesn't seem fun, there is literally no one denying you the chance of just telling everyone that your army is still from that nation. So realistically, there's not a lot of things that change by this small alteration in names. So overall, I think I'm a fan. Overall.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't have a big dog in this fight, as we said, but the side of the argument that concerns that there was more flavor to it, I feel like could be divided into 2 camps, even on the same side of the argument. There's the camp that's doing it from the lore side, and the kind of like, it's been framed as though it's a casual or competitive question, that all the casual people want the old sub factions, and the competitive people are like, cool, throw away all the lore, who cares?
Yeah.
But I'm a competitive person, and I actually am going to miss the way they were for exactly what I just said, is that I liked that it gave you more tools to be creative with building your list. I didn't care about the lore nearly as much. I mean, that's nice, but I miss that there was more like granularity with building your army based off of things that certain things wanted to do. It gave you more tools to work with. And I feel like they're consistently stripping back the tools. They've been doing it since 2nd edition. And then what we're going to see with Stormcast when we talk about their battle traits, I've got some like disappointment there. So and that's with battle traits, not even talking about the formations. We'll get into that in a second, but I think that there's an argument to be made that this is a loss from both a competitive and a casual side if you want to split people into 2 camps. And that's, I think if someone wants to grieve that, then go ahead and, approach the game how you want to approach it. But we'd hate to lose people because of something like this, and
Yeah.
obviously we'd hope that once the wounds have healed, that people want to come back and,
Yeah.
and keep having fun with their friends.
It also kind of depends whether they're gonna write some lore about the formations as well, because if there's an Elrith formation, for example, and it's a specific way that Elrith units use to fight, then it's obviously gonna have to come up in the lore as well, right? So at some point, your formations are just gonna be as fluffy as your nations were, for example, but they just have to commit some effort or put in some effort to writing out those fluff pieces, which they're not going to do for indexes, obviously, because if they're anything like 40k indexes, it's just going to be rules and Warscrolls, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean that's okay for right now, I guess.
Yeah.
We're gonna get a real quick, or really soon after the indexes come out, we're gonna get battle tomes for Stormcast and Skaven, and then we're gonna see what the real scope is.
Yeah, but
So
maybe not even then, Ryan, because there's it's not the first time that they've done a small direction change mid edition, for example.
yeah.
I always feel like the first battle tomes are a very bad indication of how something is gonna turn out. Obviously, you get the broader strokes are gonna still be the same, but the first battle tomes are always also the most boring ones, right? The most plain ones.
I get what you mean with you when using Stormcast and Cruel. Well, I call it Cruel Boys, but the Orc War Clans book when they came out. But the third book was Nurgle, and Nurgle was a fantastically written
True.
book
Yeah.
with lots of flavor and proved to still be strong later on, like even still today. So I don't know. I get what you're saying, but and there's definitely battle tone power creep, but that's another conversation.
Okay.
So, well, we have no more heroic actions, as we mentioned, which just real quickly taking index of what that means. We're losing heal. We're losing an extra unbind for an army that doesn't have as many unbinds as they'd like to have. We're losing the finest hour, which we're about to see where that goes. And what's the last one? We're losing CP. Yeah. So I'm okay with that. It's fine. Obviously, there's some armies that had as battle traits, which we're about to talk about, heroic action options. For example, Slaves of Darkness, and some other armies that really liked their heroic actions. But maybe they'll receive something else that will kind of fill in the gap.
Yeah, I don't necessarily miss those specific generic heroic actions, but I do miss the concept of heroic actions because that was one of my favorite things about the third edition.
Yeah, it's definitely neat that the heroes each have a little thing that they can do.
Yeah, as a Soulblight player, I really enjoyed using those heroic actions, and it made my heroes stand out a little bit more.
Sure. Well, especially as someone who used Manfred or Legion of Night, I guess.
Yeah,
that's insane.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually a bigger deal for Legion of Blood, but that's another story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, battle traits.
Battle traits we've always had, and I actually wanted to make a video. There's so many video ideas that I wanting to make and I never get around to it, but I was actually compiling what it actually means to have battle traits. And that's a long discussion, but the short version is it distills an army down to what its core elements are, and it's not necessarily always literally the things that fall under the pages of quote unquote battle traits.
Yeah.
Now they're trying to codify it a little bit more. And it's unfortunate that they've said, well, every army definitely has 4 formations, battle formations, as of the indexes. And then Stormcast also has 4 battle traits. And as you referenced here, possibly the same for other armies. I really hope you're wrong.
Yeah, probably
if
not.
That,
yeah.
Because some armies need more. Like for example, the code for KO is quite extensive if they're going to lose that. Or summoning, that's a big question. Summoning is a battle trait. Are the big Chaos God armies going to lose summoning? Yeah. Some people hope so, but that's definitely going to change the way they play. There's lots of battle traits. And the example we're about to look at for Stormcast, we can go to that slide now if we want, is that each one of them fits on a tiny little card. And I'm really hoping, like there's some that are current battle traits for armies that will not fit on a card this size. So
didn't they mention that all battle traits are going to fit on one page?
No, but this is definitely the example that we're being given by looking at Stormcast here. So I'm hoping that this isn't necessarily an indication of what's to come.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the battle traits for Stormcast just real quickly. I want to if this is any indication of what's to come or the style of battle traits that armies are going to see. I want to compare this real quickly with what Stormcast currently has. 2 of these are basically one current rule, which is the Signs of the Storm rule, where they get set in reserve and they come down. So they're calling it 4, but there's actually 2 of them are functionally what we would call 1 now. So that to me feels like this is actually 3. And then furthermore, the Heaven Sent rule is basically it's a command point that's a battle trait, a command ability that's once per game. It's basically just one of their holy commands reworked a bit. That was already part of the battle traits. It was a unique enhancement that you could choose one of. We don't know if those are staying in the army, but I'm assuming not, unless unique enhancements don't count as battle traits. In which case, this isn't actually anything new. So, and they're forcing you to take this specific one. And then the last thing is new. It's their version of Finest Hour, which is great and all. It's one of the only examples, evidently, we're going to see of being able to add +1 to save for units in the game. But at the same time, I'm seeing this as really only one new thing. At the same time, they lost the armor exploding. They lost the storm keep ability. They might be losing those unique enhancements for with holy commands. So Stormcast was already an army that had mediocre at best battle traits. Like really what made the army work was their translocation prayer and then a whole bunch of the deep strike and then basically just their units. Like they were just good units if you could command them well. And if that's the direction they're heading with this and dumbing things down or simplifying them, I'm a little worried for what's going to happen to battle traits with other armies. The counter argument here would easily be that Stormcast is supposed to be simple, and because it's a starter army kind of that can be used well by experts later, maybe it's supposed to stay like this and it's not an indication for anything else.
Yeah,
do you have any thoughts?
Put in little effort because they're going to get a book the first book is going to be Stormcast anyway.
That's a good point. Yeah, that could be. So
but yeah, I do agree that it seems super boring because if you think about it, what you're going to do with a Stormcast army for battle traits is once per game you're going to use a summoning kind of thing, like a command ability is to resummon a unit, and then every turn, so 10 times max, you're going to use +1 to wound, +1 to save for 1 unit. And then for the rest of the game, it's just I'm dropping units, but there's no interaction anywhere else. And nothing that makes you feel like Stormcast, no exploding anymore or something like that. So yeah, I do agree with you that they lost a bunch of flavor in if this is it.
Yeah, we're gonna have to see. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So moving on to the formations. Remember, these are the replacements for sub factions, kind of. We can cover this in more detail later, but I'm basically gonna just summarize them as saying they're more or less slightly more complicated versions of what Stormcast already has as sub-factions. Keep in mind, Stormcast had really boring sub-factions. They had 8 of them. They were not great, and they were one of our first examples of how dumbed-down sub-factions we're going to get. Remember, when we went from 2nd edition to 3rd, all sub-factions back in the day used to be like you had a required command trait, a required artifact, a command ability, and then 1 static ability, plus maybe a battle line got turned on. And in this version, they kept the battle line getting turned on, and then you only got 1 ability. And of course, you had free choice to go grab a command trait and an artifact of your choosing. But these, to me, don't inspire much of list building creativity. We're going to have to see what the command traits do, what the artifacts do, all the other enhancements. And remember, they said command traits or a version thereof are not going to be limited to just your general. So you're going to have a little bit more modularity, I think, to build things. And considering that each one of your regiments has to be led by a hero, you're probably going to have a few heroes that can be kitted out in a way that might be a little more flexible than what it currently is. We don't know exactly how that economy works, but I'm hoping that what makes the list building interesting, it centers around the rest of what we haven't seen yet on the basis of how boring these 2 are. They're fine, but they're kind of boring. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it also depends whether formations are still gonna make certain units battle line again, right?
There's no battle line. The battle line's gone. That role is totally out of the game.
True. Yeah.
It might turn on a hero being able to bring a unit as a not auxiliary, something like that.
Yeah.
Or give a hero more options for their regiment options, but there's no battle line.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree with you that these are kind of boring, but I don't really agree that it's less flavor than the previous ones. And I also don't feel like it that the previous ones enhanced your list building more than these. I mean, these are at least keyworded. Their flavor text is obviously referring to a special kind of fighting style or a combination of an army or force. So I do feel like these still bring a little bit of flavor. Like this is how you want to build your army if you're bringing a lightning echelon, for example.
Yeah, maybe I misspoke. That's not what I meant. I just meant like it's not inspiring me to, if this is the replacement for sub factions or just army abilities, it's not inspiring even a list building part of me really. I do like that. Yes, it's kind of telling you what units to bring, sure, but I think the meta, what very easily can happen is the meta is just going to say, well, these are the best units in the game.
All right, yeah.
So let's just figure out which one of these formations works the best with the best units, and then that's just your auto take.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by like losing flavor or like flexibility.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, that's still the case now, though, for a lot of armies, right?
Sure, it's just the game can always get better. We can always hope for better, and
I mean, I wish. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah. All right, so we're into combat. Yeah, we're getting there. We're making it happen, and we're going to get into the details of like the actual charging and fighting on the next slide, but this is kind of an overview here. So minor changes are to charging and fighting asterisks. What's your
asterisk
asterisk?
Means that we're going to get into that in a later slides.
Nice. We should use that from now on.
Yeah.
And then allocating damage to a unit instead of a model. Is there anything about those in particular that you want to talk about before, like the ones that we're not going to go into more detail on?
Yeah. So if they don't have an asterisk, we have to talk about them now. That's the idea, at least.
Okay, so maybe do you want to take over on the allocating unit wounds to a unit?
Sure. Yeah, it's a very small change. It's just a little bit of an easier time, I guess. Especially if you're not like a very experienced player or another tournament player, and you don't really think about placing damage on a model. Now you accidentally place it on, let's say, a command model, for example, your champion or your banner bearer or something like that. And if the dice is next to that model, you have to take that model away. Now it's just to a unit, so you can remove models wherever you please. I do feel that it eases the entire ordeal of taking away models from a unit, because you're just looking at, okay, I took, let's say, 5 damage, so I have to take away 2.5 models if they have 2 health. And I get to choose where I want to take those away instead of allocating them to specific models. So it's a small change, but I do really love that change.
Yeah, it took me a second to wrap my head around what exactly I wanted it to be more. Talked about this privately, but I wanted it to change, like that maybe you pull your command models later and it's more forgiving for where they sit in the unit, but it's not, and that's fine. I do think this is an upgrade. Especially if you could just put on like their Warscroll card or whatever, like say that you've got a unit with 5 health and they've taken 3, then you don't have to worry. There's no die to move around with them, all that stuff. It's just on the Warscroll, and it's great. Now the question is, if you bring multiple iterations of units, how are you going to do it? I guess you can put the die next to the unit still, and it doesn't sit on a specific model, and we just got to get used to that. But it's cool. I like it. It's like you said, it's not a huge change, but it's a little streamlined.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have important changes, or at least Jonas has decided that these are the important ones. Let's see if I'm on the same page.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's see.
I find these important. Yeah.
Yeah, Jonas, he decides. Let's see. Pile-in tweaks we'll cover later. No more shooting in combat unless they have that keyword. We've talked about this already pretty extensively. Yeah. It really depends on what kind of weapons or what kind of profiles are going to actually be given the keyword to shoot in combat. The only thing we've seen thus far is that one used to be a spell from the Weird Knob Shaman. What kind of weapons do you think are likely to get this? Like pistols? What else?
Yeah, pistols, throwing weapons, maybe.
Flaming weapons, maybe? Like if it's a short range.
Yeah, maybe. I I would be totally fine with almost no units getting this because it just makes the game more easy to understand. Or why do we say more easy when I can just say easier? Easier to understand. But I do think that I do hope that there's a trade-off, for units not being able to shoot into combat anymore. I do hope that a longbow, for example, actually still has a long range then, or has a decent chance of hurting someone, because otherwise, once you tie a unit up into combat, it's just over, because usually shooting units are also pretty bad in combat. So
Yeah, it could also be that it's a better way by restricting shooting units. It gives GW more flexibility to accurately cost shooting units.
yeah.
Which has been a problem. I mean, look at like the Sentinels that
Yeah.
they get turned off so easily by just raising them 10, 20 points, especially in a spam list. So maybe this gives them another knob to turn here by saying some shooting units get to keep it in combat and some don't.
Yeah.
And then you can dial it in a little better. So speaking of units being dialed in, smaller coherency. The coherency is now down to a 1/2 inch. No more lines for your 25 millimeter base guys.
Yeah,
That's gone. That an era is over. I've currently been getting real used to lining up 3 units of Skaven 20 Skaven clan rats in a row in their own lines as like layers of units you have to chew through instead of one unit that just sits there and then a huge pocket opens.
Yeah.
No more.
Yeah, and with Skaven and zombie units, for example, that were big units anyway, you'll feel it obviously, but you can still line them up pretty well. But units that were 10 models, for example, like Skinks, that's pretty rough, because I used minimum size units of Skinks to protect my castle when I played the caster version of Seraphon. I don't really know how I'm going to protect those Slann anymore.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it could be that some of those horde units get to break this rule.
Maybe.
But maybe if they have 10 models, then that's the cutoff, or more than 10 is that's the, who knows?
Yeah.
But that was just pure speculation at this point.
I mean, in the old world, wait, so there is old world now. In the Warhammer Fantasy rules, you had a keyword that was called skirmishers, and they didn't have to deploy next to each other. Is that still a thing in old world now?
Yep, it works. It's basically the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that might be a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Who knows? Although that doesn't speed up the game at all. So and half inch is way tighter. So like, it means that even though we've disappointingly a bit, we still have wholly within bubbles instead of just within bubbles now. I was really hoping they'd get rid of wholly within, and especially with this 1/2 inch thing. The flip side of it is now your units are tighter anyway, so there's a good chance they'll be more likely stuck in there. But at least the coherency is they kept the current version of the FAQ'd version where if you 6 or less, then you get to be in a line. So
yeah, I think for combat purposes, this isn't going to change much, because all combat ranges are now 3 inches anyway, so you'll get more mols into combat anyway. That's coming from a player who plays Wardens, who always had 3 inches. So I'm very curious what they're going to do with those spikes now. They need to be at least 6 inches, Ryan. I'm just telling it now. They need to be able to fight in combat while not being in combat. Because we're Lumineth.
Yeah, right. So you guys get to be extra good.
Yeah.
Question for you that made me think about the definition of combat range has now been like implicitly defined as 3 inch, and everyone has it. But what about those units that can pile in and fight at 6? Do you think they're going to redefine that as they count as being combat if they're in 6, so they get the downside? And right now they don't have any downside for being at over 3. They just get an upside of being able to pile in later. Do you think they're going to count as being in combat, so there's a trade-off there?
That is interesting. I hope not, because that would take away much of the flavor of those units, right?
Well, I hate those units, so
yeah.
Well, I don't care, but I get it. I'm biased. Sure, it's something to think about.
Yeah, I do kind of like the coherency change, because conga lines always looked weird to me and it's super unflavorful. And now, because you need to keep your models more tightly knit to each other, it's also easier to tell where a unit starts and ends. And it feels more like a realistic army, I guess, because usually you walk in formations anyway. So now that you're close to each other, it feels more like you're walking in a sort of formation, which I do like. At some point, Ryan, if we're increasingly shortening the range of the coherency here, we're just going to return to square bases.
Yeah. I mean, half inch is such a weird measuring.
It is.
You know, it's going to be something to get used to. But anyway, maybe we'll move on to retreating. What do you think about the retreating change that now because there's no battle shock, that's gone. They've kind of compared it to retreating, and now you choose to retreat and you get D3 mortal damage. Now, I don't know if you read my comment on this.
I did, yeah.
You have any thoughts about, and you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it made me like it even less.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of it. I think it should inflict D6 damage, and you can still save against it. Because then stronger units will not be punished harder than horde units. Because I do feel like if you're messily retreating, which is their entire fluffy aspect of this, right? A retreat is usually messy, so you suffer damage while retreating. Hordes are usually even more messy to retreat, easier to hit in the back, less armored as well. So they should suffer more if they have a worse save, and they don't use armor in their back usually anyway. While a hero or a Stormcast model, if they retreat, especially for heroes, it's a single model. They can probably retreat pretty well, right? So they should at least get a save against this damage. It just feels kind of bad if you retreat 2 times and you roll 3 damage, you lose a hero.
Yeah, this has got me thinking. So just for people listening, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that, because this is not current wording in Age of Sigmar at all, you're saying that it would do D6 hits that auto hit, auto wound with maybe rend, maybe not, but then it does normal damage, and then they can just save them with their armor.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. That idea doesn't exist in the game. It does exist in Old World and I guess Fantasy. That it inflicts hits, automatic hits or whatever that you have to save against. I like that a lot because you're right. People with better armor, even if they turn around, are going to still be protected from the back. And it's not mortal wounds. Like, if you think about it flavor-wise, it's literally the guys stabbing at you while you're running away. It's pot shots.
Yeah.
Now, maybe they'll have a rule. Okay, so my thing that I had thought about was, the funny thing about getting rid of battle shock and replacing it kind of with this is that big horde units don't care if you lose D3 or even D6 models. They cared about losing things to their, like losing so many models from battle shock. But the funny thing is they've now put the pressure on heroes where D3 or especially D6 is enough to maybe even finish them off. And on top of that, they didn't used to have to take battle shock tests. They were immune to it. And so it's shifted the pressure onto totally different units. And so maybe I'm hoping, obviously your solution's probably not what they did, because that would be introducing a whole new concept and they probably would have mentioned it. But maybe I'm thinking is maybe they have a version of kind of Lookout Sir for retreating, that as long as that hero is in combat with another friendly unit that's also in that same combat, that the other unit ends up basically covering his back while he leaves. You know what I mean? Like distracting you. Is it? It's just one other unit in combat. It's like it's no more complicated than Lookout Sir. It's even less complicated.
It's also much more fluffy. So
yeah, I feel like that would be a fair way to not put the pressure back on the heroes. That just sucks that a hero's like running away. Now they did say some Skaven units and probably other units of the game can cleverly retreat without taking damage, but for every hero to have to make that decision seems pretty rough.
Yeah, maybe they just make a rule where heroes retreat and take less damage. Yeah,
sure. Or it gets reduced to 1, or whatever.
Yeah. And Skaven reduced to 0, something like that.
Yeah. And you said, this is one I disagree with. I'll say right here, more focused unit roles. I don't know if this is
something that they said in the article. That's not my interpretation.
Yeah, but saying that it's important, I guess, is my point. Is that I think this is more just for people that couldn't suss out what the unit's role was because there may be less experienced players. Like the example they gave was that Kroxagor are better against infantry.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't piece that together after playing a few games with that unit, um, I, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's kind of a moot point. It's pretty obvious that that's what they're supposed to be doing. But
Yes, but they
and
they didn't
yeah.
necessarily do that, and that's the thing. If they do succeed in their intention here, and they do succeed in writing battle scrolls that fit the look and feel of a unit, that is a massive change for me, because that's where all the flavor comes in, right? You look at those units, and if I look at Croxigore, for example, I don't want to feel like they're hitting like a wet towel. I want them to swipe away units like they should. Or if I'm looking at Wardens, I really want them to be good against a charge because they have very long pikes.
Okay. Yeah, I get what you're saying, and this is not how I read their article. You're saying that they, the rules that they actually write for the given models and the given units should better reflect what they do. I totally agree with that. The way I read it is that they're going to make it more obvious how you're supposed to use the unit.
Ah, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that to me, that's not how I like. I don't need that.
Yeah, no,
Like
I
thank
agree,
you
yeah.
for explaining to me that a spear is better defensively.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's kind of how they wrote that article. At least how I read it. So I agree with you that it's nice that the models are getting closer to what they should feel like.
Yeah.
Ludonarrative dissonance is what they refer to that as sometimes, that it doesn't feel like it's doing what it should.
Yeah.
So I do agree that that's an important change for the game, but not for gameplay necessarily. It's just nice that what you see is what you get,
Mm-hmm,
you know?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, cool.
Okay.
Okay, so looking at specific things, charging
Charring.
and fighting.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Charring.
Mm-hmm.
Char away. This is you wanted to talk about flaming attacks. There we go.
I mean, at
Charring.
some point, I'm gonna make a PowerPoint presentation with no errors.
Well,
But
GW
it's not
doesn't even
today.
make no errors, so you're just trying to keep up with GW's rate.
Yeah. I mean, thank you
have
for
to
that save. Yeah.
you have to FAQ your own slides.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see how many people are complaining about those, and then we'll get an FAQ 6 weeks too late out.
Yeah. In the shorts, YouTube shorts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So charge has not changed a whole lot.
No.
It's again, it says you can't have run or retreat, so there you go. And remember, the counter charge was a charge, so therefore it turns it off. And the big change here is that you've got there's no restriction to maximum charge range, which was fixed at 12 inches, but we've talked about that, and that you have to end within ½ inch of a visible enemy unit. There's some kind of argument about this, but I think if you read it as written, all it means is that when you arrive at the charge, like within ½ inch, they have to be visible at that moment, not when you declare the charge, because it's not anywhere in the declare step. It would be cool if that was the case, if you could protect people by making them not visible somehow. But I don't think that's what this means. I think it just means if you're charging a wall, like you can't fight through them.
It does open up a very small window for a flavor-ish spell or ability where someone gets to turn invisible for a turn or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe with a ghost mist from the Ideneth, for example.
Yeah. Sure, that could be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see. Interestingly, the keywords say that they're core, which I guess means that these rules apply to the core rules all the time.
Yeah, that's gonna be the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and then fighting is basically also the same. It clears up the very often missed by especially new players. I remember I only learned about it for the first time in my third tournament, that after you make a successful charge, if you don't have anyone that's in combat with you, you can still make a pile-in. It's something you have to read between the lines in the way that the book is, the rules are currently written. And here they make it a lot clearer. So that's all that it's really doing.
Yeah.
Was there any other meaningful change here that I'm missing?
No, in your preparation document there, you did mention that they cleaned up the wording on the pylons when you're not in combat, which I do think is something that we should briefly mention.
You don't mean like what I just said about that you can, it's just more obvious that even after you make a successful charge, if no one's standing there, you can still pile in. Is that what you mean, or you mean something else?
That is exactly what I meant. And you actually just said that. Yeah, sorry.
It's all good. All good.
I mean, we did say that I was super tired, so I mean,
It's
it's
all
showing
good, man.
now. It's coming out.
Yeah, yeah, it's all good. Um, okay. So we also talked about in the right-hand column here, you mentioned the order of things that happen in the combat phase, which is important. Um, all of your abilities that aren't fighting abilities, as in literally have the fight keyword, happen first
Yeah.
in every combat phase. First, the active player, then the inactive player do all their abilities that they want to do. And I guess it's not back and forth. If you're gonna do it, you got to do it. You can't wait to see what they use if you're
Mm-hmm.
the active player. And then you do your fighting in the normal way that it works now, where the active player gets to start first, but then you go, I go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then there's always, of course, there's strike first, strike last. So you could see that as another sub phase of the fighting phase,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not too complicated to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I wrote it there is maybe a little bit misleading because it makes it look like the active player gets to fight with all their units first, which is not the case.
Yeah, and the next slide shows that if
Yeah.
like we shows the diagram that they
Yeah,
showed. So I think
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
pretty.
that's kind of what the point was with that sentence, I think.
Yeah.
Hmm.
If we move on to pile-ins, the pile-in move section here is the biggest change I would say here is one, your unit, you pick a target pile-in unit and you move that whole unit, your whole unit, in the direction to that unit that was like in combat with. Has to be, say you have multiple units you're within 3 inches of. Again, I wonder what they're going to say about 6 inches because currently it's fixed at 3. Or well, no, it says a unit that you're in combat with, but we're going to have to see what that means for those units that may or may not still have that rule. Then you move closer to that unit. You can't, or basically you can't move further away from it. So you could rotate around it, or you could just have some models stay fixed.
Yeah.
Of course, you have 1.5 inch coherency. So if you move some models, the other models are going to be a little bit more bound to move with them than they previously were. And the other big change is that you cannot totally move out of combat with another unit that you didn't choose as the target. So a popular move now is you choose to activate knowing that you can pull yourself
Yeah.
out of combat so that the other player can't even fight with that unit. And now GW is basically saying, screw that. Everyone that is at the end of the charge phase that was in combat is going to get a chance to fight someone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you could move to 2.99 inches away. So that, let's say they had a unit that was kind of strung along in a certain kind of way. Maybe not all the models, even with the 3-inch pile-in, are going to be able, in 3-inch range, are going to be able to reach them. But it's going to be a lot less feel batty than it was before. Let's say there's a good chance that half the unit's still going to be able to fight. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I kind of like
Any
that.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, it was all the pile-in moves was a point in the game where I could really tell when someone played a lot or didn't play a lot. Because that's where you really got to use your gotcha moments, right? If you place your models well and you're like, okay, I'm gonna use that unit now so I can pile them out of combat with your units, so you don't get to use that unit anymore. It was just so layered, right? You want to fight first with your big stuff. You want to fight with the stuff that's gonna die. But now you also have to keep track of, okay, what's not gonna be in combat anymore in a couple of moves. And now at least that's something that's taken off your plate, and you're always gonna have to fight, which makes sense. So I kind of like that aspect here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right that it takes a little of the gaminess out, like the clear skill discrepancies between people.
Yeah.
But it's also going to speed up the game.
Yeah.
And so there's as someone who's struggling to finish a lot of my games, even though I'm experienced with lots of games and tournaments,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really looking forward to the games playing a little faster, where I have more time to think and less time to hustle.
Exactly. Yeah.
That would
Because
be nice.
Pylons
So.
arguably took the longest time with no interaction at all, right?
Yeah, and it's no one who's having a particularly good time doing that. It's just teching your way through playing
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple little points that we haven't covered on the slides that I just really want to ping.
Sure.
One of which is that rend has evidently been reduced through the game, though we've seen very little evidence of that with the Warscrolls we've seen.
Yeah.
And
we did mention that in part 1, but yeah, we haven't seen any evidence of that. Yeah.
Right, and it's still not. Yeah, and then saves remain capped at +1, so you can only get one better than your war scroll, like what it says on your war scroll. But quote unquote, most factions lack any tools to further increase a unit's save profile. So save stacking, which they've been defined and have never talked about before, really, is largely a thing of the past. I hope they're right, because it's been one of the hardest feel bads for units that had a really great profile but couldn't quite have enough Ren to counteract all the save stacking. I really hope they're right. But we'll have to see.
So many games turned out differently just because your opponent had ways to stack saves on top of saves on top of saves, and you couldn't get through that one specific unit.
Yeah, and if you can get down to a 2+ save even after rend, you're not moving.
Yeah,
you know, and that was just a feel bad.
Yeah, and what I especially didn't like was that it even made units tanky that shouldn't be tanky. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like not literally tanks in Steam, even though they shouldn't have been that good either. But yes.
Yeah, I was more thinking about Dawn Riders, for example. In our last game, Ryan, you couldn't get through that unit of Dawn Riders, which you totally should have. But with a -1 hit and then +2 on their save and a Mystic Shield potentially, it was just so hard to get through that one unit.
That's fair. Yeah. You remember my pain. Thank you for seeing me. I feel seen.
Yeah. You know, it's actually your pain that has kind of cemented the tankiness of Dawn Riders in my mind, and now I'm inflicting that pain on every single opponent that I meet. So, you know, we're spreading the pain here.
But it's not just Dawn Riders, because they're on a 4-up base with the same as the Wardens, right? They can do that too.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah, it's a rough.
No, it's everything. I mean, I still vividly remember charging in Manfred into a 5-man unit of Liberators, and I'm like, I should totally clear this unit, right? And I just couldn't, because -1 and even -2 rend means nothing to Stormcast.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to still have that once per game ability per unit to do it, but it's only on their turn, so it's not
start of their turn or in their hero phase or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
it's not. It doesn't last into your turn. So when you really need to do it, it's not going to be as big of a threat. So I really hope they're holding to that promise, but we'll see.
Okay.
All right, Magic time. Obviously, this is a big one. Jonas, why don't you cover this, since you're more? I mean, I play Tzeentch, I play other Magic.
So ironically, Ryan, this is the shortest section of the more new rules section.
Okay.
Because there was just, as we talked about this section about this article a couple of days ago, it just isn't that exciting for me right now, and I think you did agree with that at the time of this article coming out, right?
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah. So we got both wizards and priests in the same article, and it's not that I don't like the changes, they're fine. It's just that a lot of things stayed really vague, and I still cannot really gauge how effective wizards and or priests are going to be comparatively to what they are now and compared to each other as well. So that's going to be difficult, but yeah, let's look at the changes. So they now gave every wizard a power level that's between brackets and in their keywords. So if you're looking at how many spells your wizard is going to be able to cast, you have to look at the keywords at the bottom of the war scroll. We will look at an example in our war scroll section. The number between those brackets is kind of reflecting the amount of spells, unbinds, and dispels you have per phase. So that's important to remember. That you could, in your hero phase, do 2 spell casting attempts, or 1 spell casting attempt and 1 dispel attempt, for example. That's not different from what it used to be. But what is different is that you have to keep in mind that your opponent has that magical intervention command ability now. So if they end up using a magical intervention at the end of your hero phase, you haven't saved one of your power levels for an unbind, you don't have any unbinds left.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
The phase is interesting to focus on, because they could have easily just said turn.
Yeah, exactly.
And it would have functionally mostly been the same. I wonder if there's anything that can happen off hero phase, within a turn, and then you get your whole full set back. I'm assuming not, but maybe it's just clearer because phase just makes it even clearer that it's not just turn battle round. That discrepancy. Phase is obviously twice per battle round, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with the hero phase.
I feel like some rules are written just to keep as much options on the table as there possibly can be. For example, you could release a war scroll that says you can use magical intervention several times with the same wizard, for example, and then that
Sure.
power level would make sense there as well.
Yeah, but that would still be in one phase, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But I get what you're saying.
Yeah. So that's actually not a huge change for any of us. It's mostly the same as it is. It's just a different wording and a different approach, but it basically means the same at the end of the day. What is a big change, though, is that you now have to decide on one spell lore for your entire force that you're bringing to that game. So no longer are you combining the lore of Hish with the lore of mountains, for example. You have to choose, which I do feel like that. I mean, I do not like that at all. Please do not take away tools from my toolbox. It is hard enough to enjoy Magic as it is, because it's either very swingy or your opponent hates it or you hate it if it's not effective. I mean, I don't really like reducing the options that I have for spells. I do find it interesting, though, that also means that you don't have to select spells for your wizards anymore. So you choose a spell lore, and any wizard could choose to cast any spell from that lore. You just have an amount of spells you can cast equal to your power level still. So that is interesting. It does make me wonder what they're going to do about all the god models that had knowledge of an entire spell lore, like Kroak or Teclis or Alariel, for example. Like, how are they going to differentiate that? Because there's nothing on Nagash's Warscroll that kind of reflects his spelly knowledge or magical knowledge in that regard, right?
True. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a bummer, huh?
Mm-hmm.
You think that would be on the War Scroll. It could, technically they did have a period in second edition where I don't know if it said on the War Scroll, but it definitely said next to the spell lores that all wizards and then Nagash, or all wizards and Tekla.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where they could fill that in, but you might be right that they just know the one. So here's the thing is we know that you get at least one spell lore. Like, let's say the bare minimum we know is that you get at least one of the following three things. You get either a spell lore, a prayer lore, prayer scripture, or a manifestation lore. This is the bare minimum that we're getting, that you get to choose one of those three things. There's also a version of reality where we at least get a spell lore and a prayer scripture, and then maybe you have to choose that you either take a spell lore or a manifestation lore. There's also an interpretation where you get one of all three.
Yeah.
I think all three of those are possible options of how the world's going to play out. And then there's the question of, can you double up? Is there a way to take an extra enhancement? Because right now there's nothing to do, because since endless spells don't cost anything extra, there's nothing to do with your extra points if you don't have extra, if you've got extra points left over. So maybe one of the things you can do is buy another spell lore, and buy another manifestation lore, whatever it's going to be. Because here's the problem that's going to happen. Let's say Lumineth still has the same. Let's say they have three spell lores. They've got the normal one and then the two temple ones, right?
Yeah.
Now, what happens with your temple casters? Like, do they not get access to that lore at all? Like, or maybe there's no temple lore anymore. But what if, let's say they just take all those spells and split them up evenly amongst three different just generic batches of spell lores, kind of like what we've seen they're going to do with the manifestation lores for endless spell, where they come in batches of 4 maybe. What if the absolute most broken spell comes in one with absolute shit? Like, the rest of what's in that group is just absolute shit. So you get access to all 4 spells, but you really only chose it for one.
Yeah.
And you're stuck. So now it feels like you paid a really big price for taking that one, to get that access to that one lore. And now it doesn't feel like you actually have 4 spells. You've got 4 other shitty things you can do in case that situation comes up. And that's what really sucks about it. It's kind of like how command traits work right now, is you're like, well, I really need this one command trait, and because I can't double up on them, I'm just going to have to give up another really cool one because, well, you only get one.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the direction this is going to go in, I feel like that's a really big loss to, again, list flexibility.
Yeah.
But then they have a balancing issue because what if one of the spell lores is clearly the only one that's good, and then the other spell lores is kind of mediocre, but you'd like to experiment with that mediocre one every once in a while? Then we come back to a similar problem.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be great if they had points values associated with them so that they could balance them. But I don't think they're going to do that. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, the spell lores just don't really take away any of the imbalance issues that the previous version had, and they just increase the likelihood of imbalance issues, which I don't really enjoy as well. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah. I do hope that you get at least prayers, a spell lore, and then possibly even a manifestation lore, because I would hate to choose between either my own spells, which is a huge part of my lore. Well, that's a bad word to choose in this context. Which is a huge part of my fluffiness of my army, just because I want to put some big endless spells on the table. What 100%. I do like though is that they appear to want to combine endless spells and invocations in the same manifestation lore. And obviously there are no neutral manifestations as of right now, but I would enjoy if that was the case, or if they made all manifestations things that could be cast by either wizards or priests. Like a priest could summon a Purple Son of Shaiish, for example.
That could be cool. I don't know if it makes sense lore wise, fluff wise, but yeah, I see what you're saying. Or if they just made some new endless spell models for priests.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on, casting, miscasts, and unbinds are pretty much the same as before. The only addendum here is that wizards can now also banish,
which is a godsend. It's amazing. Think about against Khorne or Fire Slayers.
It's huge.
Now you can do something about it.
Yeah. And banishing is also the term that is used for removing endless spells now as well, right?
Yes. And I don't know, are we going to... Yes, we're going to talk about it on the next slide. So let's hold off for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so for priests, I really love the fluffiness of this change, but that's so much bookkeeping. It's really intense. You're going to have to put a die next to every single priest. Okay, anyway. So every time you want to cast a prayer, you roll a dice, and you get the amount of the amount you rolled as ritual points. So let's say you roll a die, you roll a 5, you get 5 ritual points. You have to put those points next to your priest somehow. So you need to use a die or a marker or something like that to show how many ritual points they've gathered, because it is cumulative over several turns, right? So you could end up with, let's say, 15 ritual points if you wanted to. It is important though that every time you roll a 1, you lose D3 of those ritual points. And this is where Ryan and I really are curious on how the -1 on chanting is going to work with the magical intervention. Because if that means that all your 2s are also going to be turned into 1s, you're going to have a 33% chance that you're going to lose D3 ritual points on every magical intervention, right?
Yeah, so it depends on if they're saying if it's unmodified or not. And because they just described it in actual prose and they didn't let us see the actual writing in how it's written in the core rules, we don't know yet.
Yeah. I imagine it'll be unmodified, but I actually don't know.
Yeah. So, what is it? It's just the bookkeeping you don't like about this? Because
it's purely the bookkeeping.
Yeah, it's giving you something back for a failed roll, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
You know, wizards don't get that. There's one thing that people have been talking about. I think they're just overthinking it. And I get that the wording is weird, but what it basically says is you roll a d6 to generate your points, and then the effect of the spell goes off. But instead of what it is was, well, what it used to be with casting, where the roll was separate from the spell on the spell itself. In this case, the D6 is built into the actual prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And then people are saying, well, what if I saved up points and then I want to cast a different one? Sure. You still have to roll a D6 at the beginning of your chant. For I'm assuming all of them say you have to roll a D6 to chant it.
Yeah.
And then that's it. That's it. And then yes, you do have to do the spell that you just said, or the prayer you just said you were going to do, but it's just it doesn't change anything. I think people have been talking about it in kind of a weird way. I don't know if you I tuned out for a hot second there. Did you mention that some of the prayers can be amplified? Like if you roll high enough, like if you get them, you can boost
Not yet,
them
but that's
to like
the second bullet point that we're getting to now.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So each prayer has a chanting value, just as every spell has a casting value. The chanting value that seems to be like middle of the pack now is 4, I think, and that's the amount of ritual points that you're gonna need to actually get that prayer chanted, I guess, or prayed.
Sure.
And a prayer, a lot of prayers, as they mentioned, they didn't say some. They actually said a lot, I think, is the wording that they use. Not most, but a lot. A lot of prayers have tiers, I would call it, where you can use a higher amount of ritual points to increase the effect of that prayer. We'll look at an example in a bit, I think. So for example, there's a prayer that you could use on a 4, but if you spend 8 ritual points, so you'll have to have saved up at least another turn to do that, then you get to do a stronger version of that prayer, which is something I do really enjoy. And I wish that was something that was also more of a common thing on spells, because that's just super cool. That spells and prayers are just like very explosive once they reach a certain amount of value, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, you have it with Feck has got a version of that, I think, right now, and Soulblight, of course, has like better versions of their spells. The thing that's kind of nice about saving up the ritual points about prayers, fluff-wise, is that they're sitting there praying to something that they don't know if it's actually. They're praying to a deity that they hope exists. You know, like in real life, it's faith. And the cool thing about that in lore is that you're building up all this stored energy, this kind of momentum, but maybe it goes nowhere. You know, like. And maybe it doesn't actually mean anything. But whereas spellcasting isn't bound to a belief in a god or anything like that, right? It's just kind of interacting with the elements that be. And so sometimes they go well, sometimes they don't. But there's no kind of reward for believing in it, which is it's a nice fluff addition, and it makes priests a little stronger, especially if they mostly remain as one casters, if you will, where like currently in the game, we only have one priest that can cast 2, which is Ionis, the new Stormcaster. And so if they do, that was always one of the trade-offs that there's a bigger chance that they miscast, so to speak, rolling a 1 instead of rolling 2 1s. And they only got usually one chance at doing it. But then one of the upsides was that there was no interaction, which is still true. There's no way to interact with priests. And now they get an extra little buff, which we'll have to see if there are many priests that are 2 level or more. I'd kind of like to see more, but then again, the fact that you can't interact with them is pretty rough.
Yeah. Okay.
And that they're more or less guaranteed to get their thing off in the next turn, you know?
Yeah. Let's move on to the next slide for a bit. So on to endless spells, invocations, and banishing things. So we did mention that banishing is now the term that they're going to use instead of dispelling, I guess. Unless dispelling is still a thing if you want to stop a endless spell from being cast. But yeah, I mean, both wizards and priests can now banish, which is huge. You get to choose a manifestation, so that could either be an invocation or an endless spell within 30 inches, as was usually the case. And then you make a banishment roll of 2d6. If the banishment roll equals or exceeds the banishment value listed, that's also a new thing, on the manifestations Warscroll is banished and removed from play. So a couple of changes to pick out here. First of all, wizards can now do it to invocations, as we mentioned before, which is huge. It's also very, very cool because now there is a banishment value, which I find much more interesting than the current system, which means that certain invocations or endless spells might actually be quite easy to summon, for example, but hard to remove, which makes sense to me. Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, your banishment roll can now be equal to the banishment value. So that makes me think that banishment values are overall going to be harder to, harder to reach than a casting value, for example.
Sure. Yeah, because I mean, if you obviously if it was 12, there's no way to roll high. So
Yeah.
you have some flexibility to put a 12 on there if you really want it, but no one's going to have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nagash's War Scroll doesn't have any plus unbinding or dispelling, so I wonder if that's another indication that certain units it's going to be harder to get rid of these things. Also worth pointing out is line of sight's gone. Yeah, that was one of the tricks that people could pull is put one of their endless spells like what's it called, the Spite Swarm Hive behind a tree so no one can see it, and then it's just always going off like no one's getting rid of it. Now it doesn't say anything about line of sight, so that's yeah.
Nice change. Makes things a little bit easier.
Sure.
Okay, so that's it for the magic and prayers, the shortest section of them all, I think, which has us moving on to the War Scroll breakdown. So I don't know, Ryan, whether you want to talk about all the individual War Scrolls.
Maybe just a few thoughts about them instead of like going into the details.
Yeah, that seems fine. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to War Scroll breakdown. Ryan, take it away.
I mean, anyone that's seen these, I think, can figure it out pretty quickly. The big changes are we have control instead of bravery, which almost exclusively up to this point has matched exactly how much a model counts on an objective in the current version of the game.
Yeah.
So like these liberators count as 1. Nagash is the exception. He counts as 10, whereas he used to be 5. But the chariot counts as 2. Anything that counts as or has 5 or more health, it counts as 2. Thus far, heroes. So thus far, no changes. Really, it's just a more codified way. And I am curious to see if any units have 0. That'd be interesting. Is like your unit gets to fight, gets to do things, but can't hold objectives, and that's that'd be kind of neat. We don't know why the save is listed in green, like it's got a green around it. I don't think anyone knows what's going on with why that one's exceptional.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah.
Other little things are like the keywords have been cleaned up to be a lot more streamlined, and you got them in 2 layers based off of whether they affect the game or whether they're more about list building and like buff receiving.
Yeah.
The infantry keyword is given to heroes as well as other units that you would expect to be infantry, and not every unit that. Like, I was kind of thinking that Croxagore would not be infantry because they are big, chunky boys. It would say something like elite or something, but they are also infantry. So it's not just little guys. We haven't seen there's no chariot keyword. I guess we'll get there, but just while we're talking about keywords, we have seen things like war machine and monster and infantry. And I don't know if we're going to see a whole lot more terms. So we don't know what the full range of options is.
Yeah.
We can say really quickly here that we're going to see a bunch of combat abilities, and this is crit is always on a 6 to hit. That's just always happening, even if it doesn't have an ability. It's 6 is a crit now, and then it says what it's doing. Now they haven't expelled this out exactly, but my guess is that crit mortal means that it does an amount of mortal damage equivalent to your damage characteristic, and not just 1. But anyway, these are just liberators. You see what they did with like the command model. There's a champion listed in the keywords down, and then 1 out of 5 can use the Grand Hammer, but it can't be the champion, which is a change and maybe frustrating for people that have modeled them as such.
Yeah.
And then real quickly about their control value, control score. I think they handled this poorly, by the way. Your control characteristic and your control score are 2 separate ideas. And so it's tempting to say, well, if they're controlling an objective that's wholly within friendly territory, then their control value characteristic is going up by 3, which would make each model worth 4. That is not what it is. It's later defined. It's the norm. They keep their control value, the control characteristic. You multiply it by the number of models, and then you add this to the control score. So a unit of 5 goes to 8.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's everything about the liberators. Any thoughts you got there?
Yeah, no, I'm moving through the changes through the slides now because I zoomed in on several parts here, but I do think that you've covered most of it. There's nothing really super interesting going on this specific War Scroll. I do like how they've cleaned it up mostly.
Yeah.
And I really like the idea of having crits because it just makes that wow reaction a bit more impressive. Because usually you're like, I got a lot of sixes, but I actually wanted those sixes to go off on a different part of my roll. And now you're at least going to always be feeling good about a bunch of crits for a lot of your rolls, on your hit rolls at least.
Yeah, I think a lot of units will have the sixes doing something.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Pretty much it about this war scroll, I think. I'm interested to go over all the other war scrolls, but like very broadly, as you mentioned,
Sure. Yeah.
and just pick out some interesting details about those.
Yeah, I mean the reason that one's important is because it's covering what's
Yeah,
on a war scroll,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Although your choice for the second war scroll does not make this easy. So in the left-hand column of the war scroll breakdown that we've got here, you just see that we've got the movement phases in very illogical color pattern. Maybe they didn't want to do the most logical color pattern because it's rainbow, for political reasons, maybe. But like they probably should have done something that made sense. But it is what it is. And then ability icons, I think we will end up learning because they're pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Nagash, all we can say is this is our first evidence of a god model. And what I really want to know is what his points value is, because I think that's going to really set the tone. I think it would be hard to argue that this is not a good war scroll. It just depends on how many points it costs.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Nagash?
Yeah, I mean, you worded it perfectly. I think if Nagash is costed the same as he's used to, this war scroll is pretty bad, I think. For 1,000 points or something like that, or 900 points, or 850 now, or whatever it is, I don't necessarily think it's super, super strong, because there's just not as much effectiveness to him as there was before, maybe. Though a lot of things have remained somewhat the same. I found the damage a little bit lackluster compared to Liberator, for example. His profile is not that much more impressive. Obviously, he has an extra rend and his damage is better and all that stuff, but there's no fanciness on his weapons anymore. There's nothing about his armor anymore. So I do find that he's lost quite a lot of flavor. And we did talk about the Hand of Dust in the Discord. I hate Hand of Dust. I passionately hate it. I just wish, I really, really wish they would just take it away, because Nagash always gets overcosted because of that one gimmicky thing. And I hate gimmicky abilities that either make the opponent feel bad or you feel bad because it either went off or didn't went off, right? Or didn't go off. So yeah, I just wish they replaced his iconic Hand of Dust with something that is a bit less impactful to a game, because if you fail your Hand of Dust, it just really sucks. But if you succeed, it also really, really sucks. And I always feel a little bit bad when it goes off, because if you're killing a 20 or 80 wounds model with just one simple ability, it just feels really, really bad. And if you don't, your Nagash is probably dying next turn.
Yeah, I think a lot of units with big wounds characteristics might have no slay rule. You know, like it does like the Gargants have, where it subs in a certain amount of wounds it does instead of killing them outright.
I mean,
but we'll see.
Yeah, that would have to be in a generic rules section then, because Nagash is one of those models and there's nothing on his war scroll about that.
Well, he never had it, but yeah, I get what you mean. Maybe monsters with a certain wounds characteristic are higher. Yeah.
It would be weird because now you only get to pick a visible enemy hero or monster and not a model.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have strong feelings about that, other than just to point out that Rampage, and we don't know for a fact that monstrous rampages, which I'm gonna call this right now. We don't know for a fact that they happen once per turn army at the end of any turn. But this is maybe an example of what it could be, that all rampages are just at the end of the turn, and then you've got to be in like combat. So instead of at the end of the charge phase, who knows? But maybe other little things that have nothing to do with, but are indications of what the future might bring, would be, I mentioned his control score. He's got that first passive ability that's in black there. That's the only thing that remains of his war scroll that's an indication of a bracket, like you've taken wounds. So that's kind of neat. And I thought the brackets kind of sucked anyway, so this one feels totally fine. His magic is modular and brings back some of the cool flexibility that he used to have with arcane bolts and stuff, but it has to be against separate units, like the targets. And I really like the flexibility on this spell. I think it's really neat, and he can. And also worth pointing out that his miscasts do damage to him, but it just stops him from restricting him being able to cast more. So he could take, the replacement rule is fantastic, but that's for a deep dive later. Some cool things on the keywords. His War Master ability, we don't know what that does, other than maybe that's the thing that lets him take any units in his regiment that he wants, because there's no command range anymore. And maybe that means you get 2 regiments that can take 4 units in them, because he counts as a general too. Who knows? He is a monster, no surprise there. Wizard 9, so he got +1 on his ability to cast. He's probably the biggest caster, but he always was. And then he's currently tied to Osiarch, Bone Reapers, and the question is, does he get a different war scroll once they swap it out, or is that just their way of saying, here's the one that's Osiarch related, here's the one that's whatever? And maybe he cost different points in different armies.
The Facebook group said it was the latter, and I'm not saying that's 100% trustworthy, but it's something to go on.
Sure. So those are my thoughts on Nagash. I don't want to take too much time. But he is complicated.
It's just very hard to gauge how effective he's going to be if you haven't seen his point cost or the rest of his army, right?
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
So the next one's Vindictors. And there's really not much to say about these guys. They're almost exactly what they used to be, except the more wounds thing was given to the Liberators, and now they just have extra wind when they're being charged, and then they're extra good on the charge where they can get strike first on a 4+. So as we're talking about, their role is more defined, is what the spears are doing, what the shields are kind of doing, I suppose. I think they actually got a little bit of a nerf, but now they have a more defined role in the army, whereas Liberators can go out and actually do some damage. The Vindictors are more your screens, I guess.
Yeah, they're definitely a nerf because no mortal wounds anymore, but they're more on par with Liberators now, which is nice because before it was just so obvious that these guys were much better.
Right, for sure.
Okay.
Cool. Croxagore, you're the
I'm hyped.
The resident Terrapon player. What talk about this unit?
I mean, first of all, they gained a wound, which is pretty cool.
Again.
Hope maybe free of charge. We'll see.
Yeah.
I wouldn't actually mind if these units were much more expensive, but just much more effective as well. It's kind of hard to gauge for me still how effective they're gonna be, because I really hate that they're only movement 5. And that's very slow for a unit with a 4+ save and probably a big unit costs. As you mentioned, they're also infantry, which makes me sort of happy, but also feel a little bit weird about it because they don't really look like infantry. But that does mean that their extra rend is going to go off much more often than you would think, because they're going to slap things that are infantry with an extra rend. And I do feel like that'll trigger more, obviously, if even Croxagore are infantry, right? Because in that case, like, most of the Flesh Eater Court stuff is going to be infantry as well, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting it's just the only things that aren't are going to be monster machines and cavalry.
I do find it interesting how they approach the hit and wound values on their weapons in this case. They really try to underline how if you're getting mauled, literally, by a Drakebite maul, it's probably going to wound you. But it is harder to hit because it's so big and cumbersome.
That's great.
Yeah, so I do feel like they did a really good job in that regard, and that they're kind of nailing that promise so far with promising us that a weapon will do what it looks like that it should be doing. For example, a spear is good against chargers. The big mace is literally pretty swingy because it is difficult to swing. But once it hits you, it's gonna do a lot of damage, or at least it's gonna wound you.
Yeah, and obviously they have extra what we really think of as infantry rule that says once that unit's at 10 or more models. So that to me feels more like what infantry should be, I guess, by the way we usually think of infantry. But it is what it is.
And if you just do a quick math here, if you put all out attack on these guys, the Moonstone hammers are gonna hit on twos, wound on twos, versus hordes or anything with 10 or more models that is infantry is going to do 2 rend and then 4 damage, 4 attacks. Yep. That is a lot of damage. Has a lot of damage. So if you double up on these guys, 6 models, they can still spread out because it's not 7 or more. I am very happy with this War Scroll.
It just depends on the price. This is a nerd out thing I wrote in the thing, but I'm really disappointed they missed the opportunity when indexing everything to give this type of unit that has another similar unit, not a non-unique name. Like they kept using the non-unique names. Kroxigor, no comments, and then Kroxigor Warspawn. I think that's a real missed opportunity to differentiate so that you always have to use one or the other.
Yeah, it should have been Kroxigor Drake Spawn and Kroxigor Warspawn, for example.
Exactly. But whatever. It's too late.
Mm-hmm. I do find it a little bit of a pity that they only have one ability, and I know that's because there's also an ability tied to their weapons now. But just having that one small box for such an elite unit makes me feel a little bit disappointed because I just love like small abilities on the Warscrolls. But
Yeah, but you just talked about how great the unit is. I mean, obviously they're not hurting with how good their output is, right?
Yeah, it's just Brutal Blows is just such a generic ability that I wonder how many units in different armies are going to feel the exact same as Kroxigor are going to feel for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I expect that most units only have one. They said every single unit will have at least one unique ability. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, it's just like a lot of monstrous infantry have big maces or have big axes. How are you going to differentiate Minotaurs, for example, from these guys, and then all the other big stuff with big hammers? I don't know. We'll see. But it just Brutal Blows and anti-infantry are such generic rules that I do think that a lot of units will resemble each other in the index version.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The Weird Knob.
Yeah, not too much to say about this guy. So, I mean, basically, his spell, the way it used to work was that he had an ability. He had this green puke spell. It's now a shooting attack. But he also, if he was standing around 10 or more guys, he got to cast green puke for free and then do whatever spell he chose or whatever he wanted to do. And now he has a different way of being a 2-caster, plus he gets green puke for free. So he's essentially become a 3-caster if you see green puke as a spell. It's the only shooting combat thing we've had thus far. It's fine. It's kind of a side grade to what he had before. Notable thing maybe is that because he's getting that +1 power level thing, and he doesn't have a War Scroll spell, he might be a really good option to keep around as a guy who's just your unbinder in a given your own turn. Yeah. Because who knows? I mean, it's nice to have 2, but he's getting that extra one as kind of a buff, which I imagine that a lot of 1-cast wizards are not sometimes 2-casters. So you could see it as this is just my 1-caster guy that gets to be my unbinder guy as my saved unbind for just in case. But who knows? It depends on how good the spell lore is, and I think we're going to see a lot of wizards that don't have War Scroll spell. Yep. So, yeah, that's all I got to say about that guy. Oh, other than Iron Jaws is now its own, which probably means that Iron Jaws and Cruel Boys will be separate battle tomes from now on. And really good chance that Big Wah is gone. There's no reference to or clans. But I think this is totally fine. And it makes me, in the sense that I hated that everyone said that there were more armies than we had books. Because I always thought the books should be the way we define armies. But now if they become separate armies, then we go back to having, a commensurate amount of books with how many armies we have. So that's fine. Okay.
Okay. Storm Strike Chariot. Jesus.
Wow. Okay. I mean, things that are unique about this, he's got 2 rules. Maybe that makes you happy. He basically does a different kind of mortal wounds on the charge. They're worse than they were before because they were ogre charges before. He's got weapon options, and GW pulled a GW and made it so the other weapon is better than the one it used to be. The bow is way better than the spear is now. So Classic. You're going to remodel your guy, maybe. And then he gets to interact with power through one of the commands, and it becomes better. And then he gets to add D6 inches to his move, which is already 10. So he's moving 16. Well, up to 16 with the power through, and obviously he's got 10 health, so there's a decent chance he's going to get to power through. We see charge bonuses on his abilities. The companion is the only time we've seen it thus far. Anti-infantry we've already seen. He's got exploding 6s, which is crit 2 hits, which we haven't thus far seen apart from this War Scroll. And of course, he's got the War Machine keyword, which we don't know really how that's going to work out. I wonder if there's going to be anti-War Machine units, if that's really going to be something we're seeing a whole lot of. We don't know if artillery is a keyword, or are they just going to be War Machines as well? Sometimes they've kind of like ridden that line. So he lost a couple health, lost a couple inches of move, but otherwise it just depends on the price, how much the unit's going to cost.
Yeah. Celestial Blaze has a potential to be very strong, though, right?
Yeah, for sure. And of course, he's got to stay in combat, but honestly, seeing his profile, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So I don't think he's going to wipe whole units out with just this one unit.
Yeah.
I would be curious to see if you can reinforce this unit, if you could take 2. Because they're single, but who knows? Maybe that could change.
Yeah. Okay,
Slaughter
I think this
Priest.
is the last one as well.
No, we got the Warlock Engineers.
The Warlock, yeah.
Okay, so Slaughter Priest. This is obviously our first priest example. Anything that's interesting here is basically just they kind of moved around what his the Blood Sacrifice used to be like a generic spell or prayer that was Khorne new, and everyone wanted to take this so they could increase their blood type points, but now it's just fixed to this guy. So I'm assuming there's no way to do that apart from this guy, which raises the stonks on this guy in general. I always felt like this guy was a pretty auto take in the army, and now he's even more, I think. And he's still got the same unbind as if you were a wizard rule. Yeah, that's basically what's interesting about that is that means turns because he's now as if he's a wizard 1, which means he can do it in for the counter spell or like the spell that happens magical intervention as well.
Yeah,
so that's kind of nice. He keeps the Bloodbound and Gore Chosen keyword. So he's got a little more keyword soup going on here than we've seen with the other models. Otherwise, he lost his War Scroll spell. And they did give an example of what a Khorne spell looks like. I failed to mention that with the Weird Knob Shaman. They gave an example of one of their lore spells. But honestly, I'm not that impressed with either one of them.
No, that's why I didn't include them.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then we can move on to the Skaven. He's got a much longer range. It used to be 9 inches. Now it's 24 inches and basically a sniper rifle. It looks really strong. I think maybe the more important thing to mention here is not any of that, but A, he lost the wizard keyword, so he's not a wizard anymore. And B, now he's not only buffing himself, but also Warplock Jezzails, which I'm imagining are going to not be as restricted as they were because they'll probably lose the artillery kind of restrictions that they had. They probably come along with this guy in a regiment.
Yeah.
And they get to ignore the guarded hero ability, quote unquote, when picking the target for their shooting attacks. A lot of people have been reading this as though they also lose the -1 to hit ability, which we haven't talked about, but it's basically just look out, sir, now. And if your hero is in infantry, you're not visible outside of 12 inches. This is only, if rules is written, this is only saying that it turns off the part of that rule that makes it so you can't target that hero. It doesn't say that you also lose the -1 to hit.
Yeah.
So that means the Jezzails might still be having a hard time to hit that target, depending on what their profile is. Currently, that would mean he's going to a 4+. So we'll have to see. And he's our first example of an auto wound. So 6s to hit, go straight through the wound, so he doesn't have to roll. which means you go straight to save roll.
Yeah.
So
If these guys are cheap enough, I mean, I really like this war scroll. Very flexible, a little bit threatening to small heroes. It feels very sentinel-y.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
His ability is still a once per turn, or once per turn for your army. So only one of these guys can create that bubble. So I don't know if you're gonna. I don't know if that's where you're going with that. That you would maybe want to take some redundancy with these guys.
No,
But I
I think
definitely
the direction is also pretty good.
sure that he gets to 3 damage.
Yeah.
Yeah, solid.
Yeah, because a lot
There's
of small heroes don't necessarily have the best saves. And I can really see one of these guys picking off a hero, maybe even one hero a turn, even. Right? Potentially.
could be. I mean, like it depends on all the other factors. If he's hitting at -1 to hit, then a fours, threes, -2, D3, or 3. Yeah, it could be. 24 inches is great though, which we'll have to see.
Yeah.
But obviously, you're pairing him with the Giselle, so that whole team is going to probably
Exactly.
target this.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So battle packs, we could go into super big detail with these guys. Let's just plow through it and like just talk about some basics.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do separate videos on the battle packs once we see them together. As a full pack.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we've got different ways of playing the game. We got Spearhead and Path. Spearhead's new, of course. Path to Glory, match core rules, and then match play, kind of listed in like quote unquote seriousness or not. Maybe Spearhead is more serious than Path to Glory. But anyway, First Blood is basically just the core book version. I don't expect that we're going to see this a lot, but some of the big changes here are little change is that there's a north compass on the map. I don't know really why that's important, but some changes are that we have twists in missions that sometimes interact with an underdog, or sometimes we have a separate underdog thing. That basically just are the same thing we see in missions now, where there's a special rule for the mission in addition to, of course, the layout, and that now the underdog gets one extra kind of buff. Something that is kind of the standard thing for this core book is that there's only 4 battle rounds, interesting, instead of 5. And this, I think, is going to be our standard victory points distribution that we're going to see is 2 per for each of the following: hold 1, hold 2 or more, and hold more than your opponent. This seems like it's a change, but the amount that you get for each of them is consistently doubled, and including for the battle tactic, which goes up to 4 instead of 2, which they've mentioned for the most part in GHB that all missions will be capped at turns will be capped at a maximum of 4 per battle tactic plus 2, a combination that goes up to 6, so that you get maximum of 10 for that battle round for each player, meaning that every single game caps out at 50, which is great for tournaments being able to balance things. I see this as a huge buff.
I agree.
But they claimed that, again, if you take the double turn, that the double turn that you choose, you lose your battle tactic points. I get that. That means you lose 4 points, but it's not necessarily any more than it used to be just because you doubled everything. If we do have missions where there's more granular distribution of what gives you victory points, so let's say some things give you 1 or 3 instead of just 2, and maybe that has an impact. But at this moment, it's literally the same thing as dividing your total score at the end in half and just saying that your battle tactic was 2 points, which is always what it was.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes sense, if I'm explaining it well.
No, it does make sense. The only thing that the doubling up on points here does that it gives GW more room to differentiate between scoring, certain ways of scoring. Like now you have something very easy is only 1 and something middle of the pack is 3. So I do get why they're doubling up on things here, because it gives you much more freedom in divvying out how much a certain objective or something is worth, right?
Yeah, agreed. If of course those objectives are capped at 6, like we have in one of the missions, then there's some amount of flexibility, but obviously you want to try to get the max anyway. So it's only if you happen to not get the max that it's going to start to feel like you're giving up something, because the battle tactic points don't change. Apparently,
Oh
they're
yeah,
always
I
fixed.
actually meant something different, but that's also a good point. Yeah, I meant that from a design perspective, because everything is worth double what it used to be. You have more variation in what you
Yep.
can write in your rule sets as something being
Yeah.
worth 1 VP, 2 VP, or 3 VPs, for example.
Totally agree. It gives you more granularity to dial
That's
in,
the
because
word, yeah.
we never did half points,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the exact same thing as giving fractional points with the old
Exactly,
system.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, maybe the next slide and just skip ahead.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Honor Guard here, which is one of the GHB abilities, and it's just one that you can choose. To me, it's totally fine. If someone wants to talk about those rules somewhere else, we can. But I think just know that they're season abilities, and this is one of 3 abilities in the coming season that you'll be able to choose after deployment, which is kind of nice. You don't have to choose it until you've seen what your opponent's going to do.
Yeah, it's also interesting to note here, Ryan, that nothing on in this rule, at least, there's nothing written about to a minimum of 1.
Oh, yeah, interesting. That's a good point.
That's super brutal versus
Yeah.
certain units.
Oh, I didn't catch that one. That's good.
Yeah.
I wonder if that'll get FAQ, because that just turns off a whole unit.
Yep.
But so seasonal rules, there's some big changes happening here. Like the GHB is coming out in the core set as a card format, and it's really weird how they wrote this, because then they said in the standalone version it comes with other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, I have no idea how I'm supposed to interpret this. Does that mean that other stuff doesn't come with the launch book, launch box, and then you've got to like go buy a supplement? Probably not, but they worded it really weirdly.
Yeah.
It's good that you point out that it appears to be yearly. Years, at least not immediately. Also, grand strategies are gone. Before I forget that that's changed. They said that they're temporarily gone. They didn't say that they'll always be gone, but in this current season they're not there. And then yes, the battle plans, we have 12 of them. They've already told us the names of 6 of them, and they're going back to being 5 rounds each, so that doesn't change for match play people.
Mm-hmm.
They're favorites from earlier editions, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's cool. I love it.
And yeah, and then it has a map layout, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
Did
I
you
have
give
that on
us
the
any?
next slide, I think, or in 2 slides over. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the next slide that you've got here is Border War from 2016.
Yeah.
We don't need to go into detail, but basically, this one has some of that granularity of how much your objectives are worth, but you can never get
what I
more than
really like about them, including or just choosing battle plans from previous editions, is that if you try to keep up with previous editions and with competitive play back then, it makes this learning this edition much more easy. Easier, just easier. Just say easier. It makes learn this edition easier, right? Because now you don't necessarily have to focus on fleshing out the entire mission. You get the gist of it. Obviously, there will always be that extra thing about underdog and twist now, but at least you understand the mission quite quickly, and you can actually fall back on your previous knowledge about it a little bit.
Yeah, and they can kind of build, like they said, greatest hits. I imagine that some of these will keep in rotation, going forward, and that's good. Yeah, I agree with you.
I also
Yeah.
love the twist on the border war. Just want to really quickly point that out. The first sentence, at least. Victory points scored by each player from controlling objectives are capped at a maximum of 6 per turn, which I really love.
I know it sounds like it's specific to this mission, but I think it's more in holding with what they promised, that you can never get more than 10 points around.
Yeah, what I specifically love is that you don't have these massive swing turns.
Well, but that's exactly what I mean, though, is because some missions currently are like unfair to people that can really plow into that.
Yes.
And then and this is basically saying, we're going to try to rein this in so that each round feels more evenly matched, and we can better compare how people did. That's fantastic for tournaments.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's only because technically it is possible to score more than 6 if you follow the rules without that twist, right?
Yeah.
So
I just hope they don't go crazy with the rewards that they're gonna give to the underdog, because honestly, It kind of makes me think of that one mission that we currently have, where if you're the player with the least amount of points, you get to delete up to 2 objectives.
Yeah. Yeah, I know you don't like that.
I like that mission once every while, but I don't want to play every game with a small mini game going on in my head that's like I have to score just below my opponent every game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I no, totally, totally. Thus far, what we've seen has not made me feel like that it's so strong an ability that we got to worry about that.
Yeah.
But because it means you are losing,
Yeah.
and then you got to make it up. And with the points being with less swingy rounds, perhaps, there's probably less room to make a really big swing comeback. If you're giving up your battle tactic, for example, for some reason,
That's
that's
true.
that's 4 points is going to be hard to make up.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with the caps on every round.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So the next one is Device, which is a favorite of mine as well. Love Device. Very cool design. I don't think there's a lot of this mission that we have to flesh out right now.
But it was within 3rd edition, so it's something we probably a lot of people probably remember.
Yeah.
Where it cramps back into the middle there.
Yeah. The last slide though is something I really love talking about, because as a tournament player, you probably know this system very well, because a lot of tournaments, I mean, Worlds, for example, had these in their mission packs already. This makes things for the less competitive or less tournament-minded people way easier, right? I really like that they included this.
This is fantastic, and definitely what terrain should be doing. I mean, there's a lot to see here, but I mean, just pointing it out real quickly, the obvious thing is on the map, you see kind of size references to the different terrain pieces they're suggesting you set up. Currently, they've only said small or medium on this map, but there's probably large somewhere too.
Yeah.
We see no reference to garrisons, so that's a good sign, because I don't like how garrisons currently work. You're seeing 3 different basic types: area or obstacle terrain. That's one type. Obscuring terrain or place of power. And then if you look at the top there, you're seeing examples of everything and what kind of abilities they confer, which is on a short list of types of things like cover, unstable, obscuring, which seem all reasonable. And then place of power is probably going to give you some extra like buffs or whatever.
Yeah.
And they are often referencing certain things they've sold in previous sets, like Nexus Siphon, Cleansing Aqualith, Realm Gate, that kind of thing. Kind of cool. Storm Vault, and of course Wild Woods. It's neat. And something I forgot and didn't realize until we were going through it, that they haven't said anything about how far away from your opponent's deployment zone you have to set up. It's not listed in the maps. So I'm wondering if that's just a core rule or that's listed in the module or whatever. So I assume you don't get to deploy in the whole thing, but who knows?
That'd be crazy. You could just deploy in combat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we got one mission that does that now, so who knows?
I love this. It's really cool.
It's amazing. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I just hope that I really hope we get rid of mysterious terrain the way they currently are, because I've always felt like that's a throwaway module thing in the game. But we'll see. But Jonas, sorry, go for it.
I do find it weird that I understand that, for example, places of power have the unstable rule. I don't really understand what they mean with unstable or by unstable when they're talking about debris or statues, for example. Would they mean physically unstable or like metaphysically unstable, like they could explode or something like that?
It sounds like that it could do damage.
Yeah,
right, and too close to it or something, or who knows, but like deadly maybe.
Yeah.
But you know what, this has been a journey, and I know that it's been a long day for you, and the good news is we are there. We did it, my friend. We made it. I'll admit my voice is also like going right now. Like I have a sore throat from this too. So hopefully everyone back home appreciates, everyone that's listening to this appreciates the kind of content we're trying to put out. We're really sorry that we couldn't break it up into smaller ones. Jonas, I don't know how you feel about if we can't put it on Smartphones, if you want me to do individual videos as they come out, or if you want to keep storing them up like this, we'll figure that out.
Yeah, you're always free to do whatever you like. If you want to put out more content more frequently and in smaller bits, go for it, and I'll chime in on the videos where I can, and we'll see.
Yeah, but I mean, this is such important stuff of where the whole edition's going that I feel weird not including you on it. So
it's totally
we'll have
fine.
to
I have a lot of work, so go nuts.
Sure. But I've been keeping up with these updates and am so psyched for fourth. And I know we started the video with the feel bads, with the squatting. Obviously, people have had time to process it. I really hope that people are walking away from the net feeling of what they're doing with fourth edition is positive.
Yeah.
I know change is hard, and maybe it's not for everyone, and no one has to like it. I think that's worth saying. It's totally okay to dislike it. But we've invested so much in this game, and I think we all, at its core, love this game, really hard. And I hope that it ends up proving to be as good as it looks like it's going to be right now. I don't know what your feeling is for the game in general. Maybe you want to sum that up and say goodbye, but I'm very positive. What are your thoughts?
I'm feeling psyched, honestly. There's nothing that I've truly disliked about what we've seen so far. Some things have left me a little bit lukewarm about it, maybe. But that's normal. And I do think, as I said in our Discord, it's only change, right? Like, everything has to change. They need to change stuff up. Even things that they've tried before, they have to reintroduce those things, because if you keep the game as it is, it's just way too static. And sometimes bad change is even better than no change at all. So I'm happy with most everything that I've seen so far. I wish they would finally spoil a Lumineth Warscroll. I mean, come on, guys. We've talked about the magic session as in the magic article, and there was no Lumineth in there and no Seraphon Wizard either. What? Why?
What? Okay, is that the number one? If I asked you, what's the number one thing you would want to see if you only got one more spoiler article between now and then? Is that the number one thing you'd want to see?
No.
What would it be?
I need information about the shooting phase.
Whoa. Okay, that I didn't see that one coming. Why? Because of shooting phase, or you don't like the shooting phase?
I feel totally in the middle about the shooting phase. I love that there is shooting. I don't want it to overpower some games. I hate that Caradon Overlords are a thing, because I just don't like armies that are only manifesting their identity in one phase. Just like I kind of hate Seraphon magic because they're only manifesting their identity in the hero phase, and it makes for quite a boring sit through, at least in that phase. But I love mixed arms armies, and I would never really enjoy playing an army with no range at all. So that's why I really want to know how shooting works.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously they're going to cover it. I don't know if there's going to be interesting rules to cover. I think they're mainly just going to have to show us profiles to give us a sense of
there's not much to say, right?
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. But if I had to answer this, my thing, maybe it's just because I'm a list building guy, I want to see one whole example of a whole army. I don't think they're going to do that, but I just need a basis. I just need to see.
Right? Is that what you mean?
It could be points, but even more importantly for me, for list building, what units can go with which regiments, which heroes. Like, I need an example. An example. And I also want to know what kind of flexibility we have with buffing our armies for using man traits, artifacts, that kind of whatever the equivalent is now, and mount traits, all that stuff. I just want to get a good vibe, and the spell lores too, like how you divvy those out for what list building is going to look like moving forward. Because right now it's pretty vague for me. That's the one thing
it would be a super cool spoiler where they just dropped a fully legal lists but didn't explain anything about it for a week.
Oh my god, I think that would kill me.
Like, what are all these asterisks? What is that? And just let us dream.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a good one, buddy. Thank you for I know you've really plowed through. I had a blast. I've been looking forward to this for over a week now. So it's always
it is honestly a treat to do this with you, Ryan, because I learned so much more from talking about this with you. And I'm happy that you took the lead on this one, because my voice is just almost completely gone. That's why I couldn't really get into the terrain rules further, because I just felt like, okay, if I say one more sentence, I'm gonna lose my voice completely. So I'm happy it's the end, but I'm also happy that we actually still filmed it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you sound just as sexy, farmer porn star as always. ASMR is ready to go.
Thank
All
you
right,
for that compliment. Let's end on that positive note.
100%. Hey, everyone back home, everyone listening, thank you. Don't forget to do all the YouTube stuff. We're going to hopefully keep more content coming out. So 4th edition's coming, and we're going to hope maybe we'll even get another tier list in before I'm a little surprised that Jonas squeezed in that Sylvaneth one when the rules are about to change, but better late than never. Yep. And we love all you guys. Thanks for the positive reactions on all that stuff. Keep the conversation going in the Discord. And until then, guys, until the next time, Ryan and Jonas out.
Ciao.